the hot seat. Sure. How much time do we have? 5 minutes?
Now,
We're going to go, boss. Okay, boss.
My name is John Levine, and I'd like to welcome you to the evening session. As some of you know, I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and a newspaper editor, and I at first thought that Arthur Kaplan gave me this assignment because newspaper people are used to deadlines and we would be fighting a bit of a clock this evening. I've now really concluded he gave me the assignment because one of our newspapers is in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is the home of Ringling Brothers Circus, and the sort of deadlines pale by comparison to covering all that we have to cover, so a three-ring circus is somehow more an appropriate metaphor. Let me tell you that two things. One, we will run somewhat over the 9:30 close. We're delighted to have the additions to the panel that we have this evening, but to accommodate everyone, I've been given the unpleasant task of asking the panelists to cut their carefully prepared 10 to 12 minute remarks down to 5 to 8. You can imagine that made me very popular with my colleagues. Bob Pozos is also watching his time, and I have been given some sort of magic wand to make people, like the hook, evaporate if they go over time. We want at the same time on this tremendously important topic to accommodate your questions, and so we will try to fit all of this in by cutting down the time of the people here and at the same time asking you to be very succinct with the questions that you craft so that we can try to get as much breadth into the discussion as possible. Let me begin by introducing our speaker. Dr. Robert Pozos was formerly with us in Minnesota. He was an associate professor and head of physiology at the University of Minnesota Duluth. He is surely an internationally recognized expert on hypothermia and is presently the vice president for minority affairs at the University of Washington. Last spring, many of you know, he was the subject of a great deal of media attention, with many opinions on many sides, when he proposed examining and possibly using hypothermia data collected by Nazi physicians and scientists who forcibly used concentration camp prisoners as their subjects. It is appropriate that we discuss this here in the Middle West in the United States this evening, since all of us are not that far removed from Stateville in Illinois, or what happened to Native Americans through the 1960s in radon experiments, Native American children, or in Tuskegee in the South through the 1970s. It's not like it's something that happened far away and we can say we don't know anything about. Bob, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. This is a very difficult subject. It has involved me in my discussions with many scientists and with prisoners of various concentration camps. And I hope in a short period of time I can at least address some of the complexity of the issue. And I hope at the same time people realize that this is one that's fraught with much emotion. And it is very difficult, even for me, to try and dissociate the emotions of what happened to these prisoners in Dachau, Buchenwald, from the data that was gathered. One of the fundamental activities of science is to scrutinize the previous kind of experiments that pertain to the question that is being asked. This exercise has a number of very important consequences for us as scientists. One, it sensitizes the researcher as to the kinds of questions that have been raised. Two, it allows the investigator to discuss what kinds of approaches have been used and which were successful in answering key questions. And three, it also lets him know which questions remain to be asked. One manifestation of scholarly activity, therefore, is eventually some form of expression of the analysis of the research question that they are working on. Usually the term used for this expression of analysis is data, which is used to signify the overall description of the phenomenon in question. Data can take many forms. It can be mathematical expressions, plots showing the relationship of one variable relative to another, or it can be a written description of the results. Information gathering, its analysis and presentation, followed by corroboration by other investigators, are major aspects of scientific inquiry. The question of whether or not one should use information gathered by methods not considered ethical is a complex one. This kind of question engages the scientist who is traditionally trained towards analyzing data without consideration for social, ethical ramifications to now go beyond those bounds of what he normally does when he looks at data, so that he can therefore look at the ramifications of what the analysis of the kind of information means, and basically it forces him or her to ask the fundamental question of the role of scientific inquiry and hence the role of science. The model to be studied to address the complexities of this issue will be the experiments that were done on non-consenting individuals during World War II in Germany and Japan. There are two parts to this paper. The first part will be to present from a scientific point of view the research questions that faced these societies during a war effort and how they solved them. Included in that discussion will be the question of whether or not the information/data gathered from these experiments was of any value then or now. The second part will be to address whether or not scientists should use this data, and if they elect to do so, what are the consequences. Before I begin to describe these experiments, let me state that what has always disturbed me about these experiments was the cold-hearted detachment kind of thinking that went behind this approach. In fact, in discussing this issue with a scientist who did some of the work on the phosgene gas experiments, he also was repelled by the detachment of the German scientists towards the subjects. I sometimes wonder if this is not part of the doubling phenomenon that Lifton discusses in his text, Nazi Doctors. Now, being a true scientist, I need to show you a couple of slides, and where's the pointer? If I could have the slides, please. Okay. This is an example of a hypothermia lab in Duluth, Minnesota. We have used approximately 500 subjects over a period of 10 years in which we used to have subjects in cold water. We've also done cold air experiments. These subjects were consenting medical students who were involved in all kinds of experiments looking at the mechanisms behind shivering, the alteration of shivering, blood flow studies to the hands and to the feet, and recently psychological experiments in terms of how humans handle different kinds of mental functions during cold stress periods. In addition to that, our lab is involved in research studies dealing with whether or not there are racial and or sexual differences in humans in terms of blood flow to the fingers and to the toes. These studies are being done both in Duluth as well as in Seattle. In addition to that, and I apologize for the slide, we have been involved with clinicians in terms of looking at the different kinds of hypothermia that occur in patients who are involved in surgical procedures, and when they are removed from the operation, some of you know there's a pronounced shaking that occurs over the patient, and we've been involved in quantitating whether that is a hypothermic kind of reaction and or a chemical reaction. This kind of data has been presented in books, meetings, and scientific papers, and eventually results in some kind of manifestation of rate of temperature fall, heart rate, blood pressure, some other kind of physiological manifestation. During World War II, the invading armies of Germany faced a number of technical questions relative to human performance. The Germans, British, and Americans were all engaged in developing faster planes that could fly at high altitudes to escape ground fire. Consequently, the research questions that needed to be answered dealt with how high could a human fly before he passed out. The second part of that problem dealt with the fact that in the event that these pilots were shot down and landed in cold water in the North Sea, how long could they survive in that cold water? It should be emphasized that the pilots were Luftwaffe pilots who were considered the cream of German society, were very well trained, and the Germans were very interested in minimizing the loss of these very well trained personnel. Finally, the final question that the Germans asked dealt with the fact that in the event that these personnel ended up in the sea, how long could they survive in life rafts before they were rescued? What kind of water rations would they need? What kind of food rations? What kind of clothing? Consequently, the experiments dealing with salt water, how long could a person drink salt water before he became sick? What kind of methods could be used to desaltinize the salt water? All these were manifestations of asking a basic research question dealing with renal physiology. On the home front, there were various kinds of epidemics that were raging that had to be controlled to protect the home front. It is important for this discussion To phrase the experiments in this manner, the Germans faced a number of hostile environments, both internally and externally, and they needed to have information as to human performance in these situations. To a large extent, the mastery of these kinds of questions, as well as others, were essential for the survival of a nation engaged in a war effort. In the background of this discussion should be placed the fact that the Germans were obviously engaged in a systematic removal of various groups within their society. This planned genocide had its roots earlier in the atrocities that have already been mentioned. For the sake of this verbal presentation, I will concentrate only on the hypothermia experiments. However, in my written paper, I will also address the high altitude, seawater, as well as typhus experiments. The following account is based on a report submitted by Dr. Leo Alexander, an American psychiatrist working for the Army who analyzed the written records that had been submitted to Himmler and had been found buried in a secret cave in Germany. The information was discovered by American troops and became part of the Nuremberg documents. This basically is the outline or the first page of Leo Alexander's report. There is, in fact, two reports that came from Nuremberg. Leo Alexander's is the most common and well reported. There's also one that was done by some Navy personnel, which I just received a copy of. Let me explain to you a little bit of the scientific background relative to this hypothermia set of experiments. Before World War II, Dr. Welz, a physiologist in Germany, was interested in the question of what was the most beneficial way to rewarm animals that had been cooled. He discovered that he could rewarm animals who had been cooled to very low temperatures by immersing them in warm water of 40 degrees centigrade or approximately 105 degrees Fahrenheit. If the water was warmer than 40 degrees centigrade, more animals survived. Ladies and gentlemen, this was an outstanding discovery for its time. Up until that time, individuals really did not know what they could do with human subjects or humans who had been cooled. Another investigator, Dr. Lutz, also a German, used large adult pigs and was able to confirm the results of Welz's work on guinea pigs. This data also indicated that vigorous movements in the cold water did not produce adequate heat in cold water and was a basis against swimming in cold water. Neither group of animals had similar temperature regulating ability as did humans. Dr. Rascher petitioned Himmler to do experiments on prisoners of war. This is a very important point. Since Rascher was not a trained scientist, which meant that he did not have an academic appointment, he was forced to collaborate with two outstanding physiologists in Germany, a Dr. Holzner and a Dr. Fink. Most of the immersion hypothermia experiments were done in Dachau, and some initial cold experiments were also done in Buchenwald since the temperature was colder. The number of subjects that were used in these experiments is not clear, since Alexander reported approximately 130 experiments were done, while a technician of Rascher, a Mr. Neff, claims 280 to 300 subjects were used. Neff, at the Nuremberg trials, asserted that between 80 to 90 patients died. It should be mentioned that a number of subjects were used more than once, and it should be emphasized that not all the subjects who were used in these experiments died. Personal account that I've been told by one of the survivors of these hypothermia experiments was that the subjects that were chosen for these experiments were chosen by the prisoners. And in many cases, the ones that were chosen were those who had a criminal record or were creating problems in the barracks. One other point that is intriguing here is that Mr. Neff's testimony, which was used at the Nuremberg trials, had to be called into question because he himself was sort of on the hot seat, and people really don't understand or believe that his testimony is that reliable. The point to be made, though, is that both anesthetized and conscious, non-consenting prisoners of war were used. They were placed in cold water of approximately a range of 2 to 12 degrees centigrade, somewhere between 38 to 50 degrees centigrade. That is brutally cold water. Some of the subjects were nude, but most were dressed in conventional flying clothing of the time. The reason they were dressed in flying clothing was to simulate what would happen to the Luftwaffe pilot when he was downed in the North Sea. The reason they were nude was to control and compare how effective the hypothermia protection suits were. Core temperatures of the rectum or stomach, as well as peripheral ones of the skin, were recorded during the experiments. Cardiovascular monitoring consisted of heart sounds and electrocardiograms. Blood chemistry analysis were also done from both the venous sample and at times arterial sample. Urine and cerebrospinal samples were also taken. The experiments consisted of having the subject remain in the cold water until their core temperature had fallen to 30 degrees centigrade. Normal core temperature is 37 degrees. and in some cases the experiments continued until the death of the subject. Various rewarming techniques were used on the subjects. These included rewarming by means of 1, a hot bath, 2, a light cradle, 3, heated sleeping bags, 4, rubbing the body, 5, blankets, 6, some form of diathermy of the heart, and 7, by using another body to rewarm the hypothermic victim. The rate of cooling for the human subject at these water temperatures was 5 to 6 degrees centigrade per hour. Some form of muscle rigidity set place in these subjects within a 5 to 10 minute period of time, and in some cases there was frothing of the mouth. Respiration initially was increased and then became rather stable at about 24 respirations per minute. In terms of cardiac rate, the heart rate would initially be high, around 120 per minute, and then become stable and then would slow to 50. The investigators reported some form of atrial fibrillation which remained even after the body was warmed, and this would spontaneously stop sometime after rewarming. I would like to mention a point here that was made by my good friend Art Kaplan about the screening of the hypothermic subjects. In talking to some of these people who were involved in these hypothermic subjects, the screening was more than likely staged. Because when you're becoming hypothermic, ladies and gentlemen, there's no way that you're going to scream. The most you're going to be able to do is really impair your respiration, and finally what happens is you become hypothermic, you lose the ability to articulate at all. More than likely what was happening with some of these prisoners of war, they were smart. And what they were doing was staging. They were having extreme difficulty so that NEF supposedly could stop the experiment. Of the findings that were reported, one of the most important was that during the rewarming phase, after the subject had become hypothermic, the body temperature continued to fall after the removal from the cold water. Once you came out of the cold water, the core temperature continued to fall. This phenomenon, which is called afterdrop, always occurs, and in some subjects this afterdrop occurred and counted for about an additional 4 degrees centigrade rectal temperature drop. Death usually occurred somewhere between 24 to 25 degrees centigrade. According to Dr. Holzner, death always was due to ventricular fibrillation. Overall, the Dachau data used on these non-consenting prisoners of war showed for the first time the following. 1, the general signs that occurred with immersion hypothermia. 2, they identified the cause of death as cardiovascular in origin, and that more than likely the cause of death was ventricular fibrillation. 3, they established that rapid rewarming was effective in these patients. 4, they established the fact that the neck and the back of the head, the occiput, had to be protected to minimize the effects of hypothermia. And 5, they established the fact that associated with immersion hypothermia was a significant increase in blood sugar and an increase in blood viscosity. 6, they more than likely were the first in the world to come on up with an immersion hypothermia protective suit. This data is not complete to this extent. The rewarming by hot water, which was reported by them to be effective for severely hypothermic patients, is only effective in severely hypothermic patients. It is misleading since it depends upon the degree of hypothermia to the effectiveness of the warm water. In other words, if you're mildly hypothermic, the worst thing you can do is to put the person into hot water, because more than likely you're going to cause the person to faint. Because of the underground distribution of these reports, and I must say that every place I've been in the United States where I've given talks on hypothermia, there are at least 2 to 3 individuals who come up who say the following. Wasn't it proven by the Germans in World War II that alcohol was effective in rewarming patients, or that alcohol was effective in minimizing hypothermia in cold water? It is true that the Nazis did experiments with alcohol on these prisoners, and they did show that alcohol was not effective in terms of increasing the rate of hypothermia, nor was it effective in terms of rewarming. In other words, going against what is commonly thought out there, the Nazis did not show that alcohol was effective in terms of minimizing hypothermia or in terms of helping to rewarm the patient. The other controversial area is that everybody thinks that body-to-body rewarming was effective in rewarming hypothermic subjects, and that this was proven by the Nazis in World War II. The Nazis did use body-to-body rewarming, and they were able to show that that method was not effective. The point of one person on top of the other rewarming a hypothermic victim who is severely hypothermic is the point that it is not effective. Every year there are cases in which individuals are found dead, frozen together, nude in a sleeping bag. More than likely, the rationale is one person became hypothermic, the other individual then climbs into the sleeping bag thinking this is the way to rewarm the person, and they both become hypothermic because the person who's cold will take the heat from the person that's warm. In Bayfield, Wisconsin, when I've given talks there, people have said, isn't this the Dachau method used for rewarming people? It is common knowledge, and how this knowledge got out, more than likely, is after World War II, the Army knew about these experiments, and this information is throughout the United States. Although the credibility of the data is considered to be in question because of the training of Rasher, in that he was a physician and he was still trying to get an academic appointment at the university, the presence of Holzner and Finke established the credibility of the team. In this context, it is important to correct a historical misimpression. Dr. Andrew Ivy, a physiologist from the University of Chicago, was the American scientist who stated that there was nothing of scientific value that could be gained from this research. In the introduction to the Doctors of Infamy, Dr. Ivy states the following: were the criminal medical experiments carried out in Nazi Germany of any real scientific value? Question. As a matter of fact, they were not, is his answer. He then goes on to say, and this is interesting, so that the greatest of all medical tragedies was further magnified by the fact that the experiments performed added nothing of significance to medical knowledge. However, in a letter sent to Dr. Nestor, a cardiovascular surgeon in the United States, on April 10, 1954, Dr. Ivy states the following: it is true that the Nazis studied, and quite carefully, the effect of cooling on human beings. I saw the thesis by Dr. Rasher on the subject, but some of his data was obviously faked. Rasher's thesis was not on hypothermia. It was on chemical work. But then there was another very competent physiologist who worked with him and who had some worthwhile results. I had hoped at that time to collect all the worthwhile results and then have them published. Dr. Ivy basically in that letter contradicts what he wrote in the Doctors of Infamy. Dr. Ivy is the only scientist who has ever contradicted the data. Dr. Ivy's background had nothing to do with temperature regulation. He was a physiologist, a full professor, whose area of interest was gastrointestinal physiology and hormone physiology. I have a letter from a a lawyer who was at the Nuremberg trials, who basically stated that in talking to Ivy commended the following: that the data from the hypothermia, high altitude, sulfa, and typhus experiments was done by very competent physiologists, and that the data, as far as he was concerned, was very worthwhile. This attorney then goes on to state that many of the physicians who were involved in these experiments had to do these experiments because they were forced to do them at the point of a gun. And he, the attorney, had great sympathy for the victims of Nuremberg, as he called them. The point I want to emphasize here, ladies and gentlemen, is I think for the first time I have documentation that Ivy contradicted himself. And he is the only person, as I said, who was a physiologist who looked at the data, who said that it wasn't anything worthwhile. Taylor himself mentions in the Nuremberg trial that the data wasn't of any value, and more than likely he took that directly from Ivy. Of the questions that were raised concerning the data, there were a number that I want to address to this audience. One, were these experiments necessary? Or phrased another way, could the Germans have received the data another way? Was the data existing somewhere out there in the world, or was this really something they had to do, or was it an excuse? At the beginning of this summer, my son and I and another student did an extensive analysis of all the data, all the papers written in the United States, Britain, France, Japan, from 1930 to 1945. The number of papers involved in rewarming hypothermia experiments on humans was approximately 2. All the other experiments dealt with animals, and most of those experiments had no bearing in terms of rewarming or resuscitation of hypothermic victims. In other words, there was no data out there that they could turn to. There were no scientific reports. Were the scientists credible? The scientific team of Holzner, Finke, and Rasher was composed of scientists who were aware of the literature and experiments that had been done on animals. And that's why I gave you the preface before of what had been the animal experiments that had been done in Germany before they did the human experiments. It should be emphasized also, as Art Kaplan showed in his history of the data, or what was going on in Nazi Germany, that the data was presented at scientific meetings in Germany, and nowhere has it ever been mentioned that it was questioned. To me as a scientist, the question that became very important is whether or not this data has been corroborated by other scientists. Various aspects of the symptomatology of the various stages of hypothermia have been described from various kinds of experiments or isolated clinical examples. In our laboratories in Minnesota, we have substantiated that in consenting subjects whose core temperature was allowed to only fall 2 degrees centigrade, that the afterdrop was a real phenomenon. In addition, the rate of core temperature fall in subjects dressed in shorts in 10 degrees centigrade water was approximately 5 to 6 degrees per hour, as directly reported by Rasher. Another experiment in the field of hypothermia, Dr. Frank Golden, captain of the Royal Navy, expert on hypothermia, wrote the following in his thesis. It has been suggested that the experimental subjects used were likely to be emaciated and therefore not representative of the population as a whole. However, Alexander's report states that a variety of body types was used and specifically describes the effect of cooling on some emaciated subjects, page 49. Also, the rates are consistent with those now known to pertain to the population as a whole. Overall, therefore, he concludes it is reasonable to accept the major part of the report of these experiments. Further, in a paper titled Emergent Hypothermia by Major Edgar Weyburn in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 1947, who studied what happened to American pilots who were downed in the North Sea in cold water, he states the following. The observation made in case 6, which is the only case in the present series in which the patient was seen immediately after immersion in cold water, severe enough to cause unconsciousness, appears entirely compatible with the German data. Finally, two of the best-known temperature regulatory physiologists in the field of temperature regulation, A.C. Burton and O.G. Edelholm, in their classic Man in the Cold Environment, Physiological and Pathological Effects of Exposure to Low Temperatures, published in 1955, discussed the Dachau data, since it has widely been distributed and discussed, and in no way disavow any part of the data. Was the data used for any practical significance, practical application? The Germans had designed hypothermia protective suits, which incorporated the findings of the studies in that the head and neck were protected. Let me back up here a minute. This slide right here is the slide that first started me thinking about this. I first saw it in London. It's a slide used by Frank Golden when he lectures to medical students. This slide here is, as he told me, the data that he gathered from Dachau and represents exactly what happens to human subjects when they're cold. This slide is used throughout Great Britain, Scotland, in terms of educating medical students as to what happens during hypothermia. This suit is reported, and I underline reported, we don't know if it's true or not, to have been used by to have been manufactured by the Nazis and is a progenitor of the kinds of immersion hypothermia suits that we have used and tested in Minnesota. You can see one thing right up here, which is the head being very high and protected, in whether it's in cold water or ice or whatever. Therefore, the data was of practical significance in that it was used by the Nazis, more than likely in the generation of hypothermia protective suits, and maybe somehow also involved in airplane suit design as well. In this country, in addition to the hypothermia protection suits, in this country, Dr. Nestor, a cardiovascular surgeon, reported to me that the data gathered from Dachau was the basis for the beginning of doing cardiac surgery using hypothermia. He states that before he had access to these experiments, that relatively little was known about how cold to get patients and how long could they survive. He acknowledges this report in the Medical Annals of the District of Columbia in 1955, and the topic of his article is the use of hypothermia in cardiac surgery, including a report on 4 patients by Nestor et al. The question is, could this data have been used to save persons' lives at the time of the experiments or immediately after World War II, if this data was known? Yes, it's interesting that in a study in which hypothermia was being used in this country to see if it could stop the growth of cancer, one patient who was hypothermia went into circulatory collapse. Reading the paper titled, Report of a Case in which the patient died during therapeutic reduction of body temperature with metabolic and pathologic studies, Archives of Internal Medicine, in 1955, it was clear that the authors were not aware of the afterdrop phenomenon. more than likely the information that when the patient who got cold was going to, and brought out of a cold situation, was going to continue to get cold, that information more than likely could have saved that patient. Is there still some data that might be relevant to modern day studies on hypothermia? Yes, there are. The German scientists reported that there was an increase in cerebral edema in hypothermic victims, that many of the hypothermic victims who died had cerebral edema. That finding has been mentioned by one other investigator on an accidental case of hypothermia. They also reported that after a hypothermic situation, the persons had an elevation in core temperature. In other words, after the person was in the cold water, came out of the cold water, within a 10 to 24-hour period of time, there was an increase in their core temperature, which we've also noted in Minnesota. The mechanisms behind these observations is not clear, but they do pertain, and there is some interesting physiology in terms of understanding the genesis of the cerebral edema, if it does occur, to help victims who are suffering from hypothermia. Is there some negative reaction to not publishing the data? In other words, if we don't publish the data, is there any kind of problem with it? The focus of the research was to find various ways to rewarm subjects. That's what the Nazis were interested in. Until recently, no study has been done to investigate the appropriateness of one form of rewarming versus another because of the stigma attached to the research. This slide here represents the study that was done between the University of Minnesota Duluth and 15 other medical schools throughout the country, and this report was done last year, in which we studied the effectiveness of various rewarming strategies on hypothermic victims who were in emergency rooms. The reason we did this study is that there was no consensus on what was the most appropriate way to rewarm hypothermic victims in the United States, and clinicians were trying various techniques. And we were the first to do it in conjunction with some ER physicians at the University of Louisville, Dr. Dan Danzel. This data was reported in the Emergency Room Physicians Journal. In 1960, a Dr. Fay reported that he was going to stop doing research on hypothermia in this country, even though his data showed some promise towards having some effect in terms of minimizing the growth of cancer because of the stigma attached to hypothermia research. He claims that he didn't want to do any more hypothermia research because he would be accused of doing Dachau-like experiments. The next question that concerned me when I was looking this over was, were the Germans really aware of the ethical considerations of this study? I hope I've showed you that physiologically the data is valid, that it has been acknowledged by other investigators besides myself, and that there is still some, quote, data, unquote, there that can be of value to scientists and clinicians. The question that then intrigued me, were the Germans aware of the ethical dilemma? Without question, Himmler was aware that the experiments were defended on the basis of using condemned prisoners or feeble-minded individuals, and that it would be best to use scientific collaborators who are not Christian. His defense for the use of prisoners was that these studies should be done for the benefit of troops in the field. And I quote, "I believe that this solution, to transfer Dr. Rashid to the SS so that he can carry out the experiments under my responsibility and under my orders, is the best way. The experiments would not be stopped. We owe it to our men." I hope that I have convinced the audience that the information gathered was valid, and that there is still some value now in terms of the description of human response to acute cold stress in water. The question that remains is to the ethical question of whether or not the data should be used because it was gathered on non-consenting human subjects, some of whom were killed. And I think this might be the other value to this whole discussion. As a physiologist, I've aimed and concentrated on documenting the physiological validity of the data, but I also think that there might be some moral and political insights that we might gain from this kind of discussion, and in that process, maybe this data is of value. What I'm going to do to you is present to you arguments from scientists who have written to me concerning this data and whether or not it should be used. The question of the ethical aspects of the experiment. One physiologist wrote to me that the experiments were designed so that subjects would die. Thus, the experiments are inherently evil, and since nothing good can come from evil, the data should not be used. Inherently, it was designed for subjects to die. They were non-consenting, and therefore it's inherently evil and nothing good can come from it. The counter-argument, and I'm sure there are experts in the field here that know this literature better than I do, but the point I would like to make is the situation is one where I think good might come from evil. Besides the information that can be used to save human lives, the data could also be used to study the social pathology of humans in these situations. Alexander, who wrote that famous report, went back and as a psychiatrist attempted to analyze the social pathology of the German nation at the time. Lifton, in his book, Proctor, in his book, have studied a society that basically had gone berserk. Ivy, who also commented on the fact that the physicians did not act alone, and he estimated that a minimum of 200 or more physicians were involved in all kinds of experiments. In other words, even though he looked over the data, he himself went back and was trying to get some kind of reason of why these physicians did this work. He states, had the profession taken a strong stance against the mass killing of sick Germans before the war, it is conceivable that the entire idea and technique of death factories for genocide would not have materialized. I should also mention for the historical record that if you read the Nuremberg trials, that there were a number of physicians who did not take part in the experiments. The question of the validity of the data deals with the fact that the scientists were unethical, and I've heard that from a number of scientists. The argument goes that if a scientist is unethical, his data is therefore unethical, and that a scientist must have the highest ethical value, and if he doesn't, then his data on humans is suspect. The counter-argument is that there can be no correlation between the use of data and the condoning of the methods involved. If we study how an individual who is intoxicated can kill individuals in a playground, does that mean we condone the use of alcohol or the purchase of weapons? Obviously not. And the point to be made here is that there cannot be any correlation between the ethics of a scientist and the data that he or she produces. Otherwise, this society could go on a real trip in terms of looking at what is the proper ethics for an individual before he's allowed to do some kind of research. The other question is, and this has also been raised, is whether a nation that doesn't agree to certain kinds of philosophies, if that nation can produce valid data. Of course it can. A subset of this argument deals with a point that was made by one of the previous speakers before this meeting tonight, this afternoon. The subset is that the German scientist Rascher was killed for producing fraudulent data. More than likely he was killed for producing fraudulent data, but the question now becomes is, if a scientist does fraudulent data in one area, does that mean all his work is suspect? I think that anyone who does produce data that can be shown to be fraudulent, his data is suspect. Those experiments need to be corroborated by outside sources. In the case of hypothermia, high altitude, typhus, these experiments have been indirectly corroborated and fit with other sets of data. So although Rascher was killed, more than likely for producing fraudulent data, the data in the area of hypothermia stands the test of being corroborated by outside investigators. As an interesting aside, Dr. Ivy, the outstanding expert, himself fell into scientific disrepute towards the last couple of years of his scientific career when he proposed the cure for cancer by a drug called trobiacin. That data was found to be fraudulent. In the back of my mind, I sometimes wonder if he didn't think that some of the work that Rascher had done earlier on his thesis had some validity. The question that has been raised by a number of scientists is that the data should not be used since it cannot be duplicated, and therefore since it cannot be duplicated, it cannot be considered good science. The counter-argument to that is that the data has been corroborated by other scientists indirectly and is thus valid. Although no one would ever use subjects like this again, the question of duplication, which is a hallmark of good science, is not necessarily done in all fields of science. As an example, an astrological event which occurs once every 1,000 years cannot be duplicated. This does not negate the work of the original investigation, the original observation. Finally, if one uses this data, it will acknowledge the Nazi regime and also support other scientists, physicians who do similar studies, or just scientists. The counter-argument is to quote from J. Katz, "There is no system of control that will affect the unscrupulous investigator." And I'll address this fact later on. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no way you're going to stop an investigator if he or she wants to do these experiments. Is this situation so unique that there's no counterpart in history and that these experiments require special admonitions? All experiments that have used non-consenting subjects should be admonished. There's no question. But what's interesting to me is that the Japanese in World War II under the command of another physiologist, a Dr. Ishii, conducted experiments on human subjects in Manchuria in which a large number, 300, were killed by either biological weapons or hypothermia. A number of these were American prisoners of war. In addition, the United States had a decision what to make with this data. Cecil F. Hubert, a member of the State War Navy Coordinate Committee, argued or agreed with a recommendation of a group which said as follows: the Japanese information is the only source of data from scientifically controlled experiments showing the direct effect of biological weapons on man as well as cold. In the past, it has been necessary to evaluate the effects of biological warfare agents on man from data obtained through animal experimentation. Such evaluation is inconclusive and far less complete than results obtained from certain types of human experimentation. Hubert agreed to take the Japanese to give them immunity in return for their cooperation. Dr. Ishii, 5 years ago, was awarded the Outstanding Award in Japan for his work on temperature regulation in humans. Regretfully, the idea of using prisoners who were condemned to die is a very old tradition, as some of the other speakers have already mentioned, and only recently has that practice been stopped. Regretfully, the Germans were continuing a long, gory history of using condemned prisoners for scientific study. They are not the first, and I do not believe that they will be the last. Isn't this question a mute one, since the data on hypothermia has been published, and even on these Dachau experiments, and as such only raises philosophical questions? I don't think that the question here tonight really centers only on the hypothermia data for discussion of the past. Let us say, for example, that because of the easing of tension between the United States and Russia, that we will uncover data, dealing with hypothermia experiments in Siberia or mind-altering experiments on non-consenting subjects by the United States military. Should we study that data and report it back like Leo Alexander, or what? To use this data makes it seem as if a wartime situation of gathering data for national defense is a higher priority than other values. In other words, during a wartime situation, is it all right for us to use this kind of data? That does seem to be the case. If one argues from example, it seems clear that such might occur. Consider the example of a country which invades the United States and is killing its people by using some kind of nerve gas. Further consider that our intelligence agencies have received data from this country and that they have discovered an antidote to this nerve gas by work that had been done on non-consenting subjects, a large number who perished in these experiments. Would we as a society use the data to save ourselves? The answer, I believe, would be yes. Even though this data was gathered on non-consenting subjects who died, would we use that data to save ourselves? I think we would. And I therefore argue that if we use data gathered on non-consenting individuals who perished in a wartime crisis situation, why can't we use it in a peacetime situation? Does a crisis situation change our sense of the appropriateness of data? If it does, then we have some real problems. Are there any situations in which this occurred? Did we ever take this data and use it? The data that was gathered in Nazi Germany, the scientists who were used, was brought to the United States, and those of you who have read the book Operation Paperclip will see in no uncertain terms that the United States brought over the scientists who were involved in the high altitude experiments and who were the progenitors of our space programs. I'm down to less than 5 minutes, so I'm going to cut this short. What are the greatest argument, or what is the best argument against the use of this data? It gets back to what Dr. Katz said last night. The argument is that by using it, we condone evil, and we make scientific knowledge or its pursuit the highest goal to the detriment of mankind. What's the best argument in favor of the use of the data? The value of human life is great, and if we have the means to save lives, even from the data gathered from questionable means, then it should be used. A physician, in her interaction with a patient, will use data gathered from any source to help her patient, and I therefore argue that the data, if it can be used to help people, outweighs the other argument. Overall, my conclusions after thinking about this issue is that the data should be published, and that if other similar data does also arise, it should also be printed to educate the public and demystify any supported findings. It is amazing, ladies and gentlemen, what people tell me that the Nazis did concerning hypothermia. We should use the greatest aspect of science, which is the communication of our findings, to present to the public in some form what these experiments are, what was valid and what wasn't. The article should be accompanied by an ethical analysis of the study. If a scientist wants to be acknowledged for his or her accomplishments, journals should take it upon themselves to publish these unethical experiments and therefore to also damn the scientists who did these kinds of experiments. I fundamentally believe that we must educate the public in terms of what is important, in terms of what went on, so that they themselves can understand and make their own decisions. Let me briefly tell you one experience that really convinces me of this. Besides being a professor in physiology, I'm vice president for minority affairs in Seattle, and I visit a lot of minority communities. I'll never forget this discussion where a person came to me, a minority person, and thanked me for working with his son, and said, I want to thank you because the Germans showed a long time ago that we blacks aren't as smart as you whites. That that's not the truth, but he believes it. There has to be some place where the public can be educated. Implications of this paper, and I'm very short on this, and I apologize. He's giving me this nasty look, but I'll make it quick. And they should be brought out again. That in this society we have acknowledged science as the religion, and that we have erred on that side relative to the rights of humans in some ways. And I think some of the efforts that have to be taken have to be done in education. The tension that Dr. Katz talks about the resident having to do research, having to take care of patients, is real. I really recommend the following. I recommend that we in the academic community begin to look at tenure and to really decide whether or not all these papers are that important. I recommend that medical students all be required to take a course in bioethics. That includes nurses and all other people, maybe even some others. I believe that medical schools should become more part of the community, that we in the medical school have this premier idea of ourselves and we look down at some of our other cohorts. We have to demystify that aspect of our existence. We must have dialogue with other international groups of people. And I'll close on this point. In working with the Army and the Navy, I fundamentally believe that we as scientists must interact with that group. They have fantastic resources. They need people who are aware of what the questions are. We cannot leave the Department of Defense out of these kinds of discussions. Thank you very much.
story is told about John Henry Newman. Some years after he left the Church of England and converted to Catholicism, a social gathering was held in England. And the aristocrat who was holding this gathering was unaware of the depth of feelings that still existed, the resentment felt by members of the Church of England about John Henry Newman's departure. This aristocrat made the mistake of sending the same carriage to pick up both John Henry Newman and the Archbishop of Canterbury. It picked up the Archbishop of Canterbury first. When the door to the carriage swung open and the Archbishop saw John Henry Newman about to enter, he drew back aghast. John Henry Newman said, "Please, let us be at peace with one another. After all, we both worship the same God, you in your way, and I in his." Like John Henry Newman, our speaker this morning, Reverend Richard John Newhouse, is a gifted religious writer with vast learning, a remarkable command of language, and a ready wit. Like John Henry Newman, he is no stranger to controversy. He has written and edited a number of books. Perhaps the most important, certainly the most widely discussed of these books, is The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America. Last year, in July of 1988, he published an article, The Return of Eugenics, in Commentary, in which he traced similarities and overlaps in patterns of thought and practice that are beginning to establish themselves among us, and patterns of thought and practice that were firmly established in Nazi Germany. This morning, he will continue the exploration he began in that article. His title this morning is The Way They Were, The Way We Are. It's a pleasure to present Richard John Newhouse.
Thank you. Thank you, John Dolan, who reminded me this morning that we had met more than 20 years ago, and we were both actively engaged in resistance to the U.S. policy in Indochina. And at my parish in Black Brooklyn, a group of draft resistors, including John Dolan, gathered. I have not been able to stay for and to be present for all of the conference, but from what I have read, I am deeply impressed by the quality of discussion, what I can discern from the papers. Perhaps there are questions, I am sure there are questions that have already been taken up on which I will touch again. I hope the repetition is not excessive, and that the way in which I try to address the question of the way they were and the way we are will contribute to our deliberations. Arthur Kaplan asked me to take as my assignment the use of metaphors and analogies concerning the Holocaust in contemporary bioethical debates. The very statement of the topic reflects a high estimate of the human capacity for reasonable discourse. In the view of many, many people, any suggestion that there may be analogies between the way they were and the way we are, between what they did and what we are doing and what we are proposing to do, any such suggestion is to many, many people simply intolerable. The very suspicion of such similarities is too painful to bear. As Eliot observes in Murder in the Cathedral, humankind cannot bear very much reality. Reasonable discourse requires a measure of dispassion, of critical distancing of ourselves from our emotions, our intentions, our interests. And that's not easy for any of us. And the higher the stakes are, the more strongly our defensive resources are engaged. The stakes in the debates under discussion here are very high indeed. Who shall live, who shall die? Who does and who does not belong to the community? for which we accept common responsibility. Most of us want to defend most particularly our intentions, our inward dispositions. We may acknowledge that we make mistakes, even that we have done the wrong thing from time to time, but we adamantly insist that we meant to do good. If we do not exercise care, reasonable discourse about right and wrong can easily be swamped by the language of intentionality, what we meant to do. In this paper, I want to use the term Holocaust in an inclusive sense, in order to cover the constellation of crimes against humanity that we associate with the Third Reich. Of course, the term is often used to refer only to the genocide against the Jews. But in that limited sense, the Holocaust has little relevance to bioethical debates today. Nobody of influence in our society, thank God, is proposing the elimination of Jews. Nor, we do well to remember, did the Nazis one day up and decide that it would be a good idea to kill 6 million Jews and millions of other subhuman human beings. The way to crimes against humanity was prepared by peculiar ways of thinking about humanity. As Richard Weaver famously insisted, ideas have consequences. The Holocaust was, in largest part, the consequence of ideas. Ideas about human nature, human rights, the imperatives of history and scientific progress, the character of law, the bonds and obligations of political community. It is above all in the exploration of ideas that we can most usefully discuss, I believe, the metaphors and analogies between then and now. Please note also, and this I want to say most emphatically, the present paper is an exploration and not an accusation. I make no claim to being value neutral, as they say, with respect to the subject at hand. I hope that nobody here makes that claim. The purpose is to examine the value judgments and moral reasoning that inform current debates and practices, and to reflect on their similarities and dissimilarities with the Holocaust. If I suggest that a certain line of reasoning is disturbingly reminiscent of the Holocaust, I am not suggesting that those who think that way today are morally equivalent to the perpetrators of the Holocaust. The stipulation throughout is that all the participants in current debates intend to do good and not evil. One may morally challenge practices as various as abortion, embryo experimentation, fetal transplants, assisted suicide, and active euthanasia, and at the same time acknowledge that there are important distinctions to be made among these practices. They are not all the same, and that these distinctions make a moral difference. The focus here is on ideas and their uses as justifying rationales for doing this or doing that. The debates about all these matters will continue, and if they are to be both civil and clarifying debates, it is important that we not impugn the motives of those with whom we disagree. Intentions are not everything, but neither are they nothing. The present examination is for each of us also a self-examination. It assumes that as we believe ourselves to be capable of great good, we know we are also capable of great evil, no matter how good our intentions. If that assumption is not shared, this conference is, in the dismissive sense of the term, no more than an academic exercise. If we know in advance or think that we know in advance that we could not and will not commit crimes against humanity, then the question posed by this conference has already been answered, and we might as well adjourn the meeting. One kind of reaction to the question posed by this conference is described by two participants in the National Institutes of Health panel on fetal transplantation. In their minority report, they observe, quote, "Another vindication of fetal research with aborted tissues was grounded on the assumption that our inward disposition alone determines the ethical value of our behavior. Several senior research sponsors expressed to the panel their indignation that the work to which they had dedicated years of goodwill could be considered exploitative. They resented having their integrity appraised by reference to anything but their good intentions," end quote. As we shall see, this very insistence upon the sufficiency of intention has its counterpart in the experience of the Holocaust. Now, I do not wish to get into linguistic technicalities of what is meant by metaphor or analogy or other literary tropes. Our subject is the way they were and the way we are, and what they did and what we are doing and proposing to do. The question is one of likenesses and unlikenesses, of similarities and dissimilarities between then and now. And a prior question, a question that cannot be ignored, is about the very legitimacy of inquiring into comparisons between the Holocaust and present developments in bioethics. The very calling of this conference assumes that the prior question has already been answered, and I believe it has been answered correctly. The answer is that it is not only legitimate, but it is morally imperative that all of us who live after the Holocaust be examining ourselves and our actions by reference to that moment of awesome truth. The invocation of the Holocaust, the Shoah, must be undertaken with most particular caution and clarity. For those of us in the West, the Holocaust is probably the only culturally available icon of absolute evil. The only culturally available icon of absolute evil. Any, quote, revisionist efforts to deny or diminish the horror of the Holocaust are, quite rightly, deemed to be beyond the pale of responsible discourse. It is not only the so-called revisionists, however, who distort the Holocaust and its continuing pertinence. There are those who insist upon the uniqueness, the utter singularity of the Holocaust, and do so in a manner that consigns it to the unusable past. If the Holocaust is like nothing else, then the Holocaust is relevant to nothing else. As we must attend to the similarities between then and now, we must also attend to the dissimilarities. There are dangers in universalizing or generalizing the Holocaust in ways that obscure the historical particularity of the event, and that obscure as well the particular ideas, decisions, actions, and attitudes that are the parts that make up the whole of what we call the Holocaust. We intend to honor the victims of the Holocaust when we speak of the 6 million or the 10 million. But both killed and killers should, as much as possible, be recalled by name, for they had names. The Holocaust was not the abstraction we call a period of history, but it was a succession of mornings and afternoons and evenings, much like this day. It was a tangled combination of innumerable actions and consequences, of careers and ambitions, of fears and loyalties, of flirtations with the unthinkable turning into the routines of the undebatable. To most of those involved, the icon of evil did not present itself whole. It happened an hour at a time, an equivocation at a time, a lie at a time, a decision at a time, a decision evaded at a time. There is great wisdom in Hannah Arendt's description of the Holocaust in terms of the banality of evil. A generalized Holocaust is deprived of its power to caution and instruct. A generalized Holocaust is a depersonalized Holocaust, replacing persons with statistics, with allegedly inexorable forces of history. Raskolnikov, you will remember, the murderer in Crime and Punishment, well understood the uses of generalization. You recall his statement, "Anyway, to hell with it. Let them die, that's how it should be," they say. It's essential, they say, that such a percentage should every year go. It's essential so that the others should be kept fresh and healthy and not be interfered with. A percentage. What fine words they use, to be sure. So soothing, scientific. All you have to do is say percentage, and all your worries are over. Now, of course, if you use some other word, well, then perhaps it would make you feel a little uncomfortable, said Raskolnikov. This meeting would be a failure were we not made to feel uncomfortable. The more subtle truth is that it would be an even greater failure were we made to feel more comfortable because we feel uncomfortable. Our discomfort testifies to our moral integrity, or so we like to think. The suspicion is not entirely unwarranted that the relatively new profession of bioethics was established to cater to our discomfort and thus to relieve our discomfort. There are things we would not do without professional permission. What is morally doubtful must be certified by expertly guided anguish. In connection with so many life and death questions today, we hear much talk about difficult and anguishing decisions. Anguish, some seem to believe, covers a multitude of sins. In pondering analogies with the Holocaust, we may be inclined to think that this is what distinguishes us from them. We know what we are doing. We recognize and openly discuss the potential risks and potential wrongs, and our decisions are accompanied by the prescribed quota of anguish. Please do not misunderstand. The emergence of the profession of bioethics does testify to our culture's moral sensitivity. Maybe the profession has already prevented and will prevent moral enormities that might otherwise be perpetrated. Maybe. With respect to what was not thought before, or with respect to what was thought and thought to be unthinkable before, the profession of bioethics may be producing more preventions than permissions. I do not know. And I do not know if such a calculation is even possible. Would developments similar to those of the Holocaust be better kept at bay were there no discipline called bioethics? That is eminently debatable. Is professional bioethics in any sense an independent variable, so to speak? Or is it simply the mistress of the, quote, hard disciplines that it is employed to serve? Again, I do not know. Although I know that I am encouraged by the fact that there are those in the field who are not indifferent to these questions about their field. I am reliably informed that the most typical of Jewish telegrams reads this way: "Start worrying, letter to follow." One does not have to be Jewish to recognize that worry and anguish can be signs of health. With respect to current and proposed medical and biological practices, the letter that was to follow is arriving, page by page, and we know that there is a good deal to worry about. It is easy to be alarmist, to be sure, but I put to you that it is easier to deny that there is cause for alarm. I am convinced that there are unmistakable similarities between what they did then and what we are doing now. They too asked and answered the questions: who shall live and who shall die? And who belongs to the community entitled to our protection? Then and now, the subject at hand is killing and letting die and helping to die and using the dead. Then and now, the goal is to produce healthier human beings and perhaps even a better quality of human being. It will not do to say that the difference is that our intentions are good while their intentions were evil. Neither will it do to say that they were cruel and callous while we are sensitive and professionally tutored in the arts of anguish. Appealing to good intentions and producing the requisite quota of anguish are question-begging responses to the problems posed. Good intentions and delicate sensibilities are not moral arguments. Anyone familiar with the literature of the Holocaust knows too well how its perpetrators invoked good intentions and evidences of moral sensitivity to justify their actions, both during and after the fact. We are inclined today to dismiss such appeals as smarmy sentimentality and self-serving rationalization, and understandably so. But it is not always sufficiently clear on what grounds we so easily dismiss their justifications, thus denying any similarity between them and us. Sometimes we seem to be saying that we are not like them because we are not like them. If we are satisfied with that tautology, it would seem that this conference and similar explorations are a waste of time. Obviously, that tautology does not satisfy us, or we would not be here. All of us are joined in declaring never again. It would make no sense to say never again unless we believed that it could happen again. With the motto, never again, we aim to stir our society from the smug and irrational confidence that it cannot happen here. Of course, then is not now, and there is not here, and they are not us. If or when it happens again, we will, to paraphrase the popular song, do it our way. Since those who do it may continue to be in charge, since there may never be the equivalent of the Nuremberg trials, it will be called, this time not Holocaust, but progress. And we need never fear the charge of crimes against humanity, so long as we hold the power to define who does and who does not belong to humanity. Is entertaining the possibility that it could happen again, is that alarmist? I think not. It is undoubtedly alarming. To be alarmed is a sign of moral sanity. Rabbi Emil Fackenheim has wisely said, we must grant Hitler no posthumous victories. We must grant Hitler no posthumous victories. It would seem to follow that we must not grant Hitler the posthumous victory of hiding from ourselves what we are capable of doing, what we may already be doing. When we say we, it underscores the fact of moral agency, of moral responsibility. The Holocaust began in depersonalizing the victims, and it ended in depersonalizing the perpetrators. The decisions and actions that we are discussing here are not undertaken by the logic of history, nor by medical science, nor by, quote, technological progress, nor by the imperatives of research. These are all disguises, ways of hiding from ourselves moral agency. The decisions being taken are taken by us, and the first person plural is composed of first persons singular. Moral agents have names. To seek escape in anonymity, to blame forces beyond our control for decisions within our control, is already to have granted Hitler a posthumous victory. Samuel and Pearl Oliner recently published a book that, in my judgment, has not received the attention that it deserves. The book is called The Altruistic Personality, and it is based upon in-depth interviews with hundreds and hundreds of people who, at great risk to their own lives and the lives of their families and loved ones, rescued Jews from the Holocaust. And the Oliners, Sam Oliner himself having been one who was rescued by a Polish peasant and hidden during the Nazi occupation, the Oliners ask, what distinguished the rescuers from the overwhelming majority of people who averted their gaze from what was happening then, or were actively complicit in what afterwards were called crimes against humanity? What made the rescuers different? And the Oliners' conclusion is that the rescuers were distinguished not by their educational level, nor by their political views, nor by any other number of variables that might be supposed. They were not even distinguished by their attitude toward Jews. They were different, rather, in two critical respects. They typically had strong ties to communities that espoused rather straightforward and unsophisticated understandings of right and wrong. And secondly, the rescuers had an unquenchable sense of personal moral agency. One after another, they told the Oliners that they could not have lived with themselves, and many added that they could not have answered to God if they had not done what they had done. They had been told that what was happening in the Third Reich was not their responsibility. They had been told that an entirely new situation demanded anguishing decisions that could no longer be avoided. They had been told that scientific and historical necessity required a rethinking of traditional values. They had been told that familiar views had to give way to the inexorable course of progress. They had been told that short-term sacrifices of customary ways was the price of long-term advancement. And they had been told that in any event, people wiser than themselves had thought these things through with great care, and who were they to challenge the experts and those in authority? All this the rescuers had been told, and all this they refused to believe. They refused to surrender their knowledge of moral agency. As many would still say today, they refused to surrender their souls. They refused to grant Hitler that victory. In the debate over abortion in our time, there has been much discussion surrounding the image of the seamless garment as a metaphor for the so-called life issues, and I do not want here to enter into that debate within a debate, except to note that evil, like good, does seem to weave a pattern. We are considering here the finished pattern, the final solution that we call the Holocaust. The finished product may not be seamless. There are disruptions and disjunctions here and there, but the end result is of a piece. And so it is with current debates in bioethics. Consider, for instance, the NIH panel on fetal transplantation. The majority report is touchingly eager in its insistence that fetal transplantation should be and can be separated from the question of abortion. Commenting on a statement by Elie Wiesel, the minority report I mentioned says, Wiesel is saying that even by acquiescent silence after the fact, we can sign on as parties to a deed already done. But what we are considering here, and here they're speaking of the question of fetal transplantation, what we are considering here is no mere post-mortem silence, no simple averting of the gaze after the fact. We are considering an institutional partnership, federally sponsored and financed, whereby the bodily remains of abortion victims become a regularly supplied medical commodity, end quote. The minority report makes a convincing case, I think, that the majority was deluding itself if it really thought that the question of fetal transplants can be isolated from the question of how the fetuses are obtained. The minority report points out that fetal transplantation would almost certainly increase the number of abortions, compound the collusion between medical healing and medicalized killing, and prepare the way for other steps that would not only parallel but replicate actions associated with the Holocaust. In an important sense, this minority report is saying nothing new. At least it should not be new to us. As the great Dr. Johnson observed, mankind needs less to be instructed than to be reminded. In this instance, we need to be reminded of the war crimes trials in Nuremberg, and especially of the so-called medical case. That trial produced, as you know, the Nuremberg Code of 1946 that began to provide a protection for human subjects of research and inspired in due course the declarations of Helsinki in 64 and 75. The minority report of the NIH panel says, without Nuremberg and its judgment, the world's conscience might never have gazed head-on at the intrinsic depravity of the doctor's defense. The insight of Nuremberg taught us that when we take possession of others, when their bodies are forcibly delivered up to be used as we wish, then no antecedent goodwill, and no subsequent scientific yield will absolve us from having been confederates in their oppression. The Nazi doctors had learned the ethic of their profession, that a physician may not relieve one human being's affliction at the cost of another fellow human being's suffering. But they contrived to believe that if an associate had already done the subjugating, and they then did the healing-oriented research, then they could divide the responsibility down the middle. The tribunal in the world judged otherwise, and condemned the researchers for it all. End quote. The chief defendants at Nuremberg, among them the notorious Dr. Karl Brandt, who had once planned to join Dr. Albert Schweitzer in his humanitarian work in Africa. Dr. Brandt testified to the court of his great anguish in having to do things, quote, in the interests of the community when confronted by hard necessity. He had to find ways to protect the population against death and epidemics. Towards that end, the state, the law of the land, gave him permission to experiment on human subjects put at his disposal. And Dr. Brandt declared, quote, there is no prohibition against daring to progress. We should not avoid asking ourselves the painfully obvious question, do we now think that the judgment at Nuremberg was an error? Was the doctor's defense right, after all? Should the Dr. Brandts of the Holocaust have been acquitted? There are many today who seem to be answering those questions in the affirmative, at least by implication. More commonly, they condemn what the doctors did then, while approving what the doctors do now, without addressing very persuasively, the differences between then and now, in principle, in actual practice, or in justifying rationale. When challenged on the similarities between then and now, many of our contemporaries are reflexively offended by the suggestion that such a comparison might even be thought worthy of consideration. And such indignation, as we have seen, is frequently followed by taking refuge in the tautology that we are not like them because we are not like them. A rabbinical dictum has it that we should, quote, place fences around the law. The idea is that restraints and prohibitions should be in place to prevent us, or at least discourage us, from reaching the point of absolute and damning transgression. There should at least be safety rails around the abyss. Perhaps the best that our culture can provide are signposts warning against the danger ahead. The judgment at Nuremberg was such a signpost. It is no longer secure. Perhaps the signpost has been taken down. The Hippocratic Oath was another such signpost. It was. Leon Cass of the University of Chicago has written persuasively about the ominous implications in current revisions of, and in effect rejections of, the Hippocratic Oath. When the fences and the safety rails have been removed, when the signposts have been changed or taken down, what reason is there to believe that people in our time will not be capable of doing, will not do what was done then? Confidence that that is not possible, or even that it is not likely, such confidence, it is to be feared, is based on little more than sentimental naivete and the unseemly hubris of our assumed moral superiority to them. But now it may be objected, the introduction of the issue of fetal transplants and its connection with abortion has turned the discussion toward a subject that many wanted to avoid, namely abortion. Alternatively, it is said that the important debates in bioethics must move beyond the question of abortion. I've heard that a great deal. Perhaps you have too. The abortion debate, to be sure, is weary, and we have no doubt all been wearied by it. What that is new could possibly be said in the abortion debate? Perhaps nothing. But again, we are reminded of Dr. Johnson's axiom that we have more need to be reminded than to be instructed, more need to be reminded than to be engaged by new insights. Whether by inherent logic or by historical accident, almost every controverted question in bioethics today is entangled, inextricably entangled with the question of abortion. Again and again we discover that we cannot go around, but must once again go through the question of abortion. Before us are questions about who shall live and who shall die, about killing and letting die and helping die and using the dead. Questions about who belongs or what belongs to the community of legal protection, and when a what becomes a who, and when at the end of life does a who become a what. Even if some of the great questions that occupy bioethics might theoretically be isolated from the question of abortion, they seldom can be in cultural and political fact. Again, whether by inherent logic or by historical accident or by providential guidance, the abortion debate has become the magnet to which all the other life and death debates are attached. We can try to pull them away from that debate, but they are inexorably drawn back to it. Leaving aside for the moment the pro-choice arguments in favor of the abortion liberty, it seems clear that great science-based industries, trajectories of medical experimentation and ambition, and perhaps the profession of bioethics. All these rest in large part upon the settlement articulated in Roe v. Wade and related decisions. And it seems equally clear that that settlement is by no means settled. And the law of the land, as they say, may in the foreseeable future give way to the laws of 50 states. In ways even more relentless and entangled than at present, arguments about what we insist are other questions will be emerging from and returning to the question of abortion. I'm not saying it has to be that way. I'm not saying it should be that way. I'm saying it is that way, and it's going to be increasingly that way in the years ahead. A measure of moral clarity and societal consensus can only be achieved on the far side, not on the near side, of the abortion settlement. And that far side is not yet even within sight. Those who support the abortion liberty are understandably outraged when their opponents compare the more than 20 million abortions since Roe v. Wade with the Holocaust. And it must indeed be noted that the Holocaust is often invoked recklessly and unfeelingly and carelessly, as though it were simply another convenient stick with which to beat the opposition. When that is done, the only culturally available icon of absolute evil, a precious thing for any culture to possess, is dangerously debased. At the same time, however, we must ask if one believes that 20 million abortions are equivalent to 20 million instances of the taking of innocent human life, if one believes that, does not the analogy with the Holocaust become more appropriate, even inevitable? The cultural and political reality is that millions of Americans, probably a majority of Americans, 16 years after the supposed settlement, believe that abortion is precisely that, the taking of innocent human life. The same Americans are not in agreement on what that perception of reality should mean in terms of abortion law. But if we believe in a society governed by democratic discourse and decision, that perception of reality and the consideration of its legal ramifications cannot be ruled out of order. One of the lawyers who prosecuted the Nazis in the war crimes trials explained how people could have acted so savagely. He said, "There is only one step to take. You may not think it possible to take it, but I assure you that men I thought decent men did take it. You have only to decide that one group of human beings have lost human rights," end quote. But the objection is heard, such an observation is irrelevant to our discussion of bioethics in the Holocaust, in abortion, in fetal transplantation, in embryo experimentation, in new methods of fertilization and withdrawing food and fluid from the comatose. In all these instances we want to object. We are not dealing with human beings, or at least we are dealing with the dubiously human. But those who want to make that objection must ask themselves whether it is not touchingly naive. The very objection assumes one favored outcome of the debate that is still underway over who or what is a human being, and when whats become whose and whose become whats. It will not do to employ the fatuous rhetorical device of declaring that the other party must be wrong because we are right. The Nuremberg prosecutor said there is only one step to take. In the case of the debates in which we are now embroiled, I suspect that that step was taken in the adoption of the idea of quality of life as an indicator of who is and who is not to count as a member of the community. Back then, they spoke of Lebenswert zu Leben, Lebensunwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. It is by no means clear to many thoughtful people how we, in principle or in practice today, distinguish Lebenswertes Leben from quality of life and quality of life indexes. But we still insist it should be clear. After all, in the Holocaust, they were killing actual human beings. People who are undeniably, universally acknowledged, not just potentially or marginally, real people with real rights. But once again, it seems that we are found to be begging the question. It is exactly the point that they did deny what we take to be undeniable. Similarly, with respect to issues such as abortion and fetal experimentation and euthanasia, many today deny what an earlier generation to be undeniable. It is the boundaries of deniability that are at stake, and these are culturally and morally determined not by technology or science or medicine. That Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and Slavs and others were not human beings in the full meaning of the term was the doctrine of the Third Reich. Such people were clearly not included in the community of legal rights and immunities and protections and entitlements. Such was the law of the land. Such was the view of those who were declared to be the best and the brightest of that society. Who was to say that they were wrong? A relatively few daring souls, such as Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, said they were wrong and paid with their lives. They said the Nazis were wrong on the basis of clear reason, of common sense, of civilizational tradition, remember the fences and the signposts, and on the basis of biblical faith. And the rescuers studied by the Uhleners, they said that this doctrine was wrong. And they acted courageously on that conviction. Some of them explained their actions in terms similar to those articulated by the Bonhoeffers. Many others, it seems, acted because that is the way they had been taught to act. They could not act differently and still be themselves. Others seemed to act instinctively, intuitively. They had, one might say, a good nose for evil. They were a small minority, acting outside the law and against the law, in a society that acknowledged no law other than the fiat of the state. It requires no great leap of creative imagination, I put to you, to see the parallels, at least with respect to their social placement and psychology, between the rescuers then and efforts such as Operation Rescue now. I have written elsewhere about what I believe is accurately described as the return of eugenics. By that phrase, I mean to include most of the controverted issues in bioethics, from fetal farming and harvesting to infanticide and assisted suicide. We tell ourselves that these issues are raised by medical and technological advances, and so we seek to reduce our sense of moral agency and responsibility. We are closer to the truth, I believe, if we acknowledge that the debates in which we are embroiled are the products of moral, cultural, and political change. Christopher Lasch has recently and insightfully written about the engineering of the good life. He notes that there are no longer freak shows at carnivals and county fairs in America. And the reason for that, we tell ourselves, is that as a society we have become more sensitive to the handicapped, or as we are tutored to say, to the differently advantaged. Lash suggests that this may be a convenient self-deception. The reason there are no more freak shows, he invites us to consider, just maybe, is that we have become a society that no longer has a place for freaks. At Nuremberg, the prosecution argued that the killing programs unfolded one from another. That the genocide of the 6 millionth Jew was somehow unleashed by the morphine overdose given the first hair-lipped child. Judgment at Nuremberg was premised upon the now frequently derided notion of the slippery slope. Those who deride and dismiss that metaphor are, I believe, rejecting the commonsensical observation that one thing is connected with another, and one thing frequently does lead to another. If we give ourselves permission to do one thing, we are inescapably inviting the question about permission to do the next thing. Most current debates in bioethics have less to do with technological progress than with moral permissions. In large part, the profession of bioethics is the permissions office of contemporary medical and biological science. Bioethicists are permitted to give out permission slips, with the understanding that, after due and anguished deliberation, of course, permission will not be refused. And it is the bold bioethicist who dares to say, and continues to dare to say, no. As he or she may quickly discover, the profession leaves such sensitive souls behind as the discussion moves on to the next thing for which permission is desired. It is easy to be alarmist. It is easier to deny the reason for alarm. We say we know the difference between questionable human life and undeniable human life, while it is evident to all but the willfully blind that lives once thought to be undeniably human are now thrown into question. Again, the awesome step was taken, I think, with Roe v. Wade. In the lethal illogic of that decision, it might be suggested, we encountered our first hair-lipped child. The late Paul Ramsey tirelessly reminded us that we should not give ourselves a principle of permission to do what we want if the same principle permits the doing of what we abhor. A principle established by the scrupulous, Ramsey reminded us again and again, a principle established by the morally scrupulous is no longer the exclusive property of the morally scrupulous. It is public, it is entrenched in practice, and it is there to be exploited by others who view our abhorrence at the suggestion of doing the next thing as being no more than our irrational inconsistency, for the principle that we endorsed did not preclude the doing of the next thing. We think of the Holocaust as a rampage of irrationality, but as we tend to overlook the banality of evil, so we overlook the rationality of evil. Consider a recent and acclaimed work, Science and the Unborn by Clifford Grobstein. Dr. Grobstein is by no means a man of evil intention. On the contrary, he is a biologist and embryologist of distinction, who, we are assured by noted bioethicists, possesses exquisitely attuned ethical sensitivities. Grobstein knows that a great weakness of the pro-choice argument in the abortion debate is that it downplayed or dismissed concern about what is or who it is that is being terminated in abortion. The American people, he recognizes, insist that that concern not be treated lightly. I'm sure many of you saw the New York Times CBS poll published April 26th of this year, indicating that 16 years after the Supreme Court ruling, only 21% of the public favors the policy of Roe v. Wade, Fully 48% think abortion is the same thing as murder. A Boston Globe and Los Angeles Times poll 2 weeks earlier had 57% identifying abortion as murder. We may well challenge, I do challenge, the use of the term murder in this connection. But I ask you, do we really believe that ours would be a less violent, a more caring, and a more morally sensitive society if those people, our fellow Americans, were less concerned about what or who is terminated in abortion? I think not. And Grobstein knows that that is a major concern, and so he acknowledges that scientifically, even the embryo, the pre-embryo, is, as he says, human to the core. If abortion policy and policies that permit non-therapeutic abortions with the unborn are to be stabilized as he wishes, they must be, Grobstein says, both rational and sensitive to the views of what he describes as a moral society. Religious beliefs opposed to what Dr. Grobstein proposes are deemed by him to be irrational, especially if they are Roman Catholic or fundamentalist beliefs, and he tends to conflate those two. Therefore, a rational policy must finally be devised and implemented by experts in national and local commissions. Their task, says Grobstein, is one of, quote, status assignment, with respect to who is and who is not to be treated as a person with rights. And not all who are given status assignment as human beings are also given, quote, protective status assignment. It depends on how they come out when measured by an index of the quality of life. And those who are in charge of assigning status can also reassign status, Dr. Grobstein knows, for he is a rational man. Grobstein is primarily concerned about the treatment and uses of the unborn, but he acknowledges that his argument also has clear implications for the reassignment of the born, especially the elderly and the gravely handicapped. Nonetheless, he assures us, in the short term, the application of the approach he advocates can be limited to the early stages of life. It is important to note that the lethal use of the embryo, for example, does not diminish, he says, its human status. According to Grobstein, on the contrary, its human dignity is enhanced by its sacrifice of its life for the betterment of humanity through, for example, medical experiments and fertilization procedures. A key component in Grobstein's argument is deserving of most particular attention. He acknowledges that even the pre-embryo has, quote, biological membership in the human community and must be respected for its, quote, profound potential to become an individual in the fullest sense, an undeniable person. And then he says this, such respect is appropriate so long as the unborn has a reasonable probability of continuing development to become an infant and then an adult. And then note this, the situation is transformed if, for whatever reason, a particular pre-embryo has no reasonable prospect of developing further, end quote. And why does it have no reasonable prospect of developing further? The answer is very simple, because we have decided to terminate it. We have not deprived it then, you see, here is the logic. We have not deprived it of its potential life, because by virtue of our decision, it had no potential life. In that case, Grobstein writes, the unborn need only be assessed and valued for its then existing properties without reference to what it might have become in a normal human life history. The doctrine being propounded, I suggest to you, could not be more clear. With respect to human dignity and human rights, the reality is what we define it to be. There are no prior rights that are there for us to respect. Rights are created by our very assignment of rights. Grobstein explicitly states that the idea of unalienable rights endowed by nature and nature's God can have no place in bioethical discussions. As philosophers might put it, the objects of abortion, medical experimentation of all sorts, once we have made the decision, they have no ontological status. They have a social political status if we choose to assign them such status. They are, in the most sober and solemn sense of the word, they are what we agree to say that they are. And the we who do the agreeing are, when it comes down to it, the experts who are capable of making rational definitions untainted by the religious and other prejudices of what Grobstein calls the frozen past. Now, why have I gone on for 2 pages about science and the unborn? Because it is recent, because it is acclaimed, because its author and its arguments are in the mainstream of current bioethical debates. We know they are in the mainstream because those who define the mainstream, for example, Daniel Callahan and Father Richard McCormick, say that Grobstein and his arguments are in the mainstream. We might have chosen, however, any number of other books or articles. It is not accurate to say that the argument advanced by Clifford Grobstein and others is reminiscent of the Nazi doctors. I do not say that. I say that in critical respects, it is a replication of the argument advanced by the Nazi doctors. Those who remember where they heard this kind of reasoning before. Dr. Karl Brandt and his colleagues argued this way almost 50 years ago. At Nuremberg, the civilized world rejected that argument, and now it seems that we are reconsidering that rejection. And the suspicion may not be entirely unwarranted that to the degree that we are reconsidering, we are the less civilized. Once again, I emphasize that the point here is not that abortion and embryo experiments and other practices are morally equivalent to what was done in the Holocaust. That is not the point. There are many and important differences and distinctions that must be made. My point is simply that some justifying arguments for such practices today are very much like the arguments employed in the Holocaust, and that this is reason for deepest concern. In addressing then the use of metaphors and analogies concerning the Holocaust in contemporary bioethical debates, I have tried to limit myself to similar habits of mind and patterns of reasoning. There are many other analogies that might have been mentioned, each of them worthy of a paper in its own right. For instance, the euphemized vocabulary of death, by which we employ language that conceals from ourselves, and we hope from others, what it is that we are doing and proposing to do. For instance, the high stakes of wealth then and now, of power then and now, of prestige then and now. Now all that invested in developing technology and practice. And there is much else that is much like the Holocaust, but enough already. I do not wish to end on a note suggesting despair. We should not grant Hitler a posthumous victory by succumbing to doctrines of historical or technological inevitability. Then is not now, and there is not here, and they finally are not us. The banality of evil speaks of the everydayness of evil, of decisions made day by day, on days no doubt much like this day. And remembering the banality of evil can remind us of the banality of virtue. Virtue, as Aristotle tells us, is a matter of habits, and as Dr. Johnson tells us, a matter of remembering. Our time is not so new as we sometimes like to think. Demystified of the techniques and the professional jargon, the hard questions facing us today are at their heart the questions faced by the prophets of old. Who is my neighbor? To whom am I neighbor? Recognizing this truth does not give us the answer to all our bioethical questions, but it does keep before us the nature of the questions that we are answering. The broken fences around the law can be repaired, and new fences can be erected. The safety rail surrounding the abyss can be strengthened. The signposts of Hippocrates and Nuremberg can be retrieved and refurbished. These things can be done. We cannot know whether they will be done. I confess that I draw encouragement from the way in which, in the last 16 years, a democratic people, opposing almost every establishment and elite of the society, has refused to acquiesce in the lethal illogic of Roe v. Wade. But there is still a very, very, very long way to go, and every step of that way is shadowed by the Holocaust. The way they were is, in important respects, ominously like the way we are. But that past need not be our future. The very holding of a conference on bioethics and the Holocaust may be taken as a sign of determination that that past not be our future. Never again, we say. Never again. Never again. We simply do not know. And finally, we do not need to know. Eliot had it right. For us, he said, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business. Thank you.
Those of you with questions, please write them down. There will be people collecting them. I'll read them to you.
Oh, okay.
Right, I wonder, who had Benjamin Friedman's question? It's in here? I'm not so sure, I don't know where it is, I'm not sure I'll get to it. All right, here's the first question. Why did you define abortion as the taking of an innocent human life? Is it okay to take non-innocent human life? For example, capital punishment, U.S. terroristic killing, activities in Nicaragua, and so on?
Well, there certainly is a venerable moral tradition that suggests that, against an absolute pacifist position, that there are situations in which it is morally permissible and perhaps even mandatory to take human life. Capital punishment being one, more classically the justified war tradition, that there are circumstances of self-defense, for example, even personal self-defense or defending one's family, that one might take human life. So yes, the distinction between taking innocent human life and human life that is by virtue of that person's action or by that person's complicity in a circumstance that requires the taking of that life, that distinction is a very important one, and not being an absolute pacifist, I would tend to affirm it. There is an important distinction between innocent human life and others, just as it'd be, I think the asker of the question would agree, there's an important distinction between, say, imprisoning an innocent human being and imprisoning a guilty human being. It's not just a question of taking the life, it's a question of depriving people of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, or property, if you will. Our whole legal justice system assumes that the distinction between innocence and guilt is a rather critically important one.
We have two questions on this card. The first is, you imply that the Holocaust is comparable to other things and events. Please give an example.
I would hope that the whole paper was an illustration or an attempt to illustrate ways in which facets of the Holocaust, particularly its justifying ideas, are analogous to debates and practices in our own day. I don't want, however, to disagree at all with those who want to preserve. In fact, I want to join them in wanting to preserve what is singular and distinctive about the Holocaust. This is an argument that goes on, for example, between Elie Wiesel and Simon Wiesenthal, the, quote, Nazi hunter. The one thinking that the Holocaust should be described in its more inclusive sense, as I was using it in my paper today, encompassing the many crimes against humanity and practices that led to those crimes under the Third Reich, and the other wanting to preserve it more, in a more narrow sense, for the genocide against the Jews. I guess I come down more on Wiesenthal's side on this, because as I said in the paper, if you say the Holocaust is so unique, such a singular thing, that it's just an isolated point, as you will, in history, that is like nothing that went before and nothing that went after, then we have consigned the Holocaust to an unusable past. That is, we have at most preserved it as a horror story to be tribally celebrated by the descendants of its victims. And I think the Holocaust is much, much more than that. I think it is a story in which we read a great deal about the human condition, and as painful as it may be for us, about ourselves.
The second card, or third card here, has on it this question and some comments. Who is my neighbor? I am your neighbor. The woman you've ignored throughout your discussion of the fetus's death and life. Please remember me and my sisters in your comments.
You and whoever you is here, wherever you are, and your sisters and women who feel under most painful and compelling circumstances the need to have an abortion and have an abortion were present in every line and between every line in my presentation. Anybody who has been a pastor, as I have, in a poor and welfare black community of Brooklyn for 17 years, cannot be ignorant of the experiences of going with people through the kinds of decisions that women, their families, in some cases at least their men, accompany them. The question before us, however, is if we are going to justify or the elimination of what is unquestionably human life from a scientific, commonsensical, civilizational, and up till recently legal viewpoint. How do we do that without establishing a principle which, as Paul Ramsey says, gives permission for the doing of that which we abhor? And I put to you that women and blacks and Jews and the poor and the handicapped in our society have a most particular interest in pressing these questions. Because if, as the lethal illogic of Roe v. Wade suggests, these questions are going to be answered finally by those who have the power to say, we will respect the rights of those who can impose their right upon us. If that's, which I think is the lethal illogic of Roe, if that is going to prevail, let everybody who has ever been in this society or any other under the heel or at the bottom of the pole, let them most particularly look out. So it is precisely for sisters and brothers, and most particularly for the most marginalized. The physically, mentally, economically, socially most marginalized, that this paper was written and delivered.
The next question is, please explain your statement, the Holocaust also depersonalized the perpetrators.
Yes, well, by that I meant that we know how it depersonalized the victims. These are subhumans, and all kinds of categories were devised in order to deny the participation of these people within the fullness of the human community. But the perpetrators also clearly were depersonalized, in that they depersonalized themselves, but systemically were involved in a system that aided them in that depersonalization in order to hide from themselves their moral agency. I mean, if one reads the texts, the transcripts of Nuremberg, for example, one cannot help but be impressed at the myriad ways, the sometimes sophisticated ways, in which people were eager, the defendants were so eager to depersonalize themselves, to let anything be admitted to evidence other than the first person singular. I did this. And that's depersonalization. It was historical necessity, it was the law of the land, it was medical and technological progress. In other words, there were all these other things that did this. I didn't do it. Or so they claimed. And the judgment at Nuremberg, which is one of the few signposts in our culture that we, at least up till now, have been able to rely upon for a while, said back to them very clearly, no, you did it. And thereby personalized them again, made them persons, actors, moral agents.
The next card reads, you've made use of a quote by Emil Fackenheim that goes beyond its original intent. Fackenheim was saying to Jews and not to others that we Jews not give Hitler posthumous victories by denying our Jewishness. I take offense at your using this phrase to bolster your argument against abortion. Please comment.
I can only assure you that Emil Fackenheim does not take offense at it, because we've discussed it. And did I go beyond what, in the original context, I think the writer of the question is quite right. That was the point, that Jews who are not Jewish, who somehow abandon that identity which was the crux of the Holocaust, were in fact giving Hitler a posthumous victory. But I think Fackenheim, I know Fackenheim himself, has used the expression, I have used the expression, I know he approves of the use of the expression, to cover a number of ways in which the thinking or the unthinking, the remembering or the forgetting of the Holocaust ends up serving the purposes which Hitler intended to advance, including the purpose of eliminating world history from the presence and influence of living Judaism.
Next, as an agent of the church, it's interesting that you did not address the role of the church directly or indirectly in the Shoah and the ethical implications of that. Why? And there's a parenthetical comment. Please don't limit yourself to objections by German clerics to the euthanasia program in the early 40s.
Well, there are many things I didn't address in the paper, but certainly I would agree with what I take to be implicit in the question, at least, that the record of the churches, mainly of the Evangelisch or Lutheran Church and of the Roman Catholic Church, during the Weimar period leading up to the Third Reich, the ascendancy of the Third Reich, and then through the period that we call the Holocaust and the Second World War, that record is, for the most part, with some notable, glowing exceptions, a shameful record. There's just no question about it. There's no question about the fact that the teaching of contempt with regard to a Christian theological depreciation of Judaism, sowed the seeds for the political anti-Semitism exploited by the Nazis. And that responsibility must be accepted without equivocation, without ifs, ands, and buts, by Christians. And I, as a Lutheran Christian, very much do. So there's a marvelous new study, which those of you who are interested in this, a 2-volume thing by a young German historian who died, unfortunately, just before the 2nd volume was finished. Klaus Scholter, published by Fortress Press, called The Churches in the Third Reich, just out this year, which I think is, in 30 years of my reading in this literature, is really about the best, most careful assessment of the very checkered and usually shameful record of the Christian churches during that period. But fascinating reading.
Next, your comments on abortion and the indication that abortion is ethically objectionable suggest that the state should prohibit this activity rather than allowing people to rely on their own moral sense in making the decision for themselves. Is your prescription really any different from how behavior was directed by the German government from 1933 to 1945?
Sure, and it depends, doesn't it? And we all have known this now for 16 years of the abortion debate and how these questions are framed differently. On the one hand, you're saying, well, you're asking for a government denial of freedom, namely of the abortion liberty, which has been established, at least since 73, as a fundamental constitutional right. And that's one way of, that's the quote, pro-choice way of framing the question. Then on the other side, no, we're asking for the protection of all human beings, including the unborn, which is the first and most basic duty of any government to defend its people. And so that argument goes back and forth. How's it going to be settled? I don't know. I don't have a prescription, to use the questioner's answer. I know that clearly in this democratic society, and I believe in democracy, I believe in we the people. Not that vox populi, vox Dei by any means. The people can be dreadfully wrong, dreadfully wrong. But in this case, I think the American people have intuitively at some times and at a highly sophisticated level of rationality in other instances said no to Roe v. Wade. It's not clear what they want to say yes to. And that's going to become a very, very intense debate in the years ahead. The abortion debate, I suspect, is just beginning. And we should all brace ourselves for that. I would hope that minimally there would be a pedagogical use of law, as again Paul Ramsey famously wrote about, that would be biased toward life, biased toward preserving every life that came into being. And that there would be an expansive, inclusive definition of the human community rather than the narrow, exclusive definition of the human community of the raw individualism of Roe v. Wade. See, in this, I first started writing about abortion in 1967, my goodness, 22 years ago now, when we were talking about liberalized abortion in New York. And the first article I did in a national magazine was making the case that the protection of the unborn should be the liberal case. And I was very much a person on the left at that time, and perceived to be such, because what has liberalism has two great strands to it. One is radical individualism of a kind of libertarian market-oriented form. The other form of liberalism is the civil rights movement, say in the prophetic leadership of Dr. King, a communitarian understanding of always expanding the community which we want to include and which we want to care for. And it seemed to me that way back in the 1960s in New York and California and Hawaii, that the liberal flag, if you will, got planted on the wrong side of the abortion debate. For it seems to me that the, quote, pro-life side is the liberal position, trying to expand that definition of the human community. I hope that in whatever succeeds, whatever follows Roe v. Wade, and Roe v. Wade, I think it almost certain will not stand. Maybe not go down with Webster, it may be another 2 or 3 decisions, but it seems to me, and I know to many others whose jurisprudential wisdom I have great confidence in, whatever follows it, I hope it would bias the pedagogical function of law in favor of life. That is, discourage people who think that, well, because it's legal to get an abortion, therefore it must be moral. People who always confuse the law, what's legal with what's moral. Put that pedagogical function on the side of life. Reduce dramatically the actual number of abortions. There will always be abortions. In the best of all possible worlds, just as there will always be other very, very tragic events. And perhaps most important of all, reconceptualize the American experiment in an inclusive and comprehensive rather than narrow and exclusive sense. That's not a prescription for what ought to happen. It is a set of hopes, if you will, and of directions that I think hold high promise, not for a resolution of the abortion debate. It'll never be resolved. It will reach a certain state of political, cultural, legal stabilization at some point or another. And nobody, or almost nobody who's been involved on any of the sides in the last 16 years of dispute will be really happy. I think everybody in this has to accept that. As someone on the pro-life side, I have indicated what I think we should work toward and do everything we can to achieve that. And in doing that, persuade people who disagree with us that this really is something, this course of action, this direction, that is in their interest too. But we have to be a good deal more persuasive than obviously some of us have been to date.
We seem to have a card from almost everyone in the audience, but there's
And I'm
only
going on too long, so
there's only
sure,
we
please.
unfortunately have time for just one more question. This final question reads as follows: we had 2 women who were in Auschwitz among Mengeles twins testify in favor of abortion. How can this be?
If we could understand why it is that thoughtful and reasonable and fair-minded people arrive at different conclusions. Okay, we've just heard from the one witness saying that neither of them testified in favor of abortion. So we'll skip that question.
The Nazis chose life or death over those they controlled. With respect to a God who gives us free choice to follow his will, who are we as a government body to choose for a woman her decision to terminate pregnancy?
Well, put the question differently. The responsibility of the state to protect the life that is jeopardized. If we can't agree that both those questions have to be asked, you see, then we're not even talking to each other. If I exclude someone's question, if I exclude that question, say, well, that's a stupid question. The issue is not a woman's right or need or felt need for an abortion. We're not going to discuss that. Well, clearly we're not going to have a discussion, just as if that person excludes framing the question in terms of protecting the unborn. Whatever one may think about the debate of the last 16 years and actually going back before that about liberalized abortion, I think most people on the pro-choice side, like Clifford Grobstein, for example, recognize that one of the big mistakes that was made by the pro-choice activists was to exclude the argument that is inescapable, and that is, gee, isn't it sad about the baby, or the fetus, or whatever that is? And that, I think, and I agree with, and I know there are people in the pro-choice Planned Parenthood and other councils who are thinking and writing very clearly about this. That was an enormous mistake. It was an enormous mistake to say to the American people and to try to sell politically that we want you, in effect, to close your eyes and to harden your heart, which is what it amounted to the question of the baby. You can't make that kind of either-or choice. Now, the difficulty for the pro-choice position, on the other hand, and here I understand their problem, is that once you admit that question, then you're into it. You're into the heart of a debate that you wanted to avoid. And it no longer then is simply a manner of bumper sticker, pro-choice, pro-life. It becomes a question of, gee, who is my neighbor, and to whom am I neighbor, and how do we exclude that without establishing principles that will exclude other forms of human life that I do not want to see excluded? And you get into the whole can of worms, if you will, that is, at its elevated and best, moral discourse. And if we can move beyond Roe v. Wade and beyond the frequently senseless polarizations of the last 16 years to something like public moral discourse in the political arena, then maybe some great good will come out of all this, also for the vitality of American democracy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I didn't know that was the most important question.
It's not the case that every speaker was expected to address that question.
Thank you, Dean Brown. I want to welcome you and thank you for attending on behalf of the Biomedical Ethics Center. This is our second annual major public conference. Last year we had one on reproductive issues. It's the first, and we hope first annual time, that we will be able to have an international convening of expertise, such as in this room for this conference. We're very excited about the conference. Having looked at the papers, I learned an immense amount, and we hope you all have the same experience and will participate in the discussions and in the debates as the days go on. I want to particularly thank the sponsors of the conference, the Otto Bremer Foundation, the Minneapolis Federation for Jewish Services, the Richard and Judith Spiegel, Whitehead Associates, University of Minnesota Medical School Minneapolis and Medical School of Duluth, an anonymous donor, and the Minnesota Dakotas region of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Also, I would like to acknowledge the great assistance, without which we could not have had this conference, of university resources that have been involved for the last several months in bringing together this conference. Continuing medical education, media resources, university relations, and the special events office. Also, I want to draw your attention to a recent addition to the program, which was not on the original brochures that you received. Thursday, tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock, there's going to be an interdenominational service of commemoration and remembrance here at the Radisson. It's a non-liturgical service. It will include poetry reading and music, and we invite all the participants who are interested to please attend. That service is organized by the B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation. The next welcomer is Rabbi Irvin Wise, the executive director of that organization. Rabbi Wise has agreed to provide an overview, or what we call the big picture, of the Holocaust, what happened anyway, where, when, how, who, and following that, the rest of the conference participants will focus significantly more on the involvement of scientists and the medical personnel during that time. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Rabbi Wise.
I would like to welcome you on behalf of a number of concerns and parts of the community. First, the B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation at the university, and also on behalf of the Council of Religious Advisors here at the university, who also, that is, the members are very concerned with many of the issues that the Center for Biomedical Ethics deals with regularly. I also would like to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Jewish community of the Twin Cities and of the Minnesota Rabbinical Association. The Holocaust, at least for me, whenever I have the opportunity to participate in a program for it, creates ambivalence. I think that's good. On one hand, when confronting the Holocaust, the only appropriate response often seems to be that of silence. On the other hand, the awesomeness of the historicity of the Holocaust, the mystery of the Holocaust, how immense it is, at the same time challenges many of us to, perhaps even demands of us to struggle and to grasp, to explore, and I think also to hope that by inquiring and remembering we are advancing, and by assuring ourselves that we do not forget, we are learning. A number of different people are gathered here from different countries, different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different academic and scientific backgrounds and disciplines. And I think that's usually a very strong thing to happen. Especially so in case of the Holocaust, because I think many issues and concerns, if not exclusively, then definitely uniquely and perhaps most urgently, converge around the Holocaust. Issues of politics and militarism, issues of economics and finances, issues of psychological and religious power, spiritual and ethical issues, and of course scientific and medical concerns. It's interesting, perhaps not surprising, that in Jewish circles, Jewish legal circles, the most significant halachic discourse which takes place in the latter part of the 20th century revolves around science, technology. It's not just an attempt to harmonize the mechanics of religious observance with modern technological society. That's part of it, much as the medieval religionists had to try to harmonize philosophy with revelation. But it's also a concern with figuring out what do we do and what don't we do. Judaism and many other religious approaches to life assumes much, and I think much at the center of the religious raison d'etre is the assumption that there are things we should do and things we should not do. And so in Jewish law we debate, and the responsive literature today is overwhelmingly includes, I would say, it's not defined by debates around euthanasia, abortion, organ transplants, and issues similar to this. Interestingly, I would say the most meaningful and authentic theological and theosophical discussions within the Jewish world, but also within the Christian world, I would say, take into consideration, if not most critically, definitely very significantly, issues of the Holocaust. I would suggest that you cannot have any responsible theological inquiry or debate without dealing with the Holocaust. If theology and theosophy were difficult before the Holocaust, how much more so now? I already alluded to, I think, what may be considered the pivotal point of these debates, and that is human free choice and free will. Erich Fromm, in a book, Revolution of Hope, pointed out some years ago that Western human beings living in a technological society somehow have concluded that anything we are able to do, we should do. And we haven't considered the possibility that there may be things we can do that we would be better off not doing. In the 30th chapter of Deuteronomy, we may find the beginning of religious existentialism. I would suggest we do, where we're told, I put before you life and death, blessing and curse, good and evil. Choose life. Implicit in this biblical statement, obviously, is the opportunity we all have to choose death. I think we have to consider that what we choose to do and choose not to do and how to do it and when to do it and why to do it has, if not immediate, then ultimate consequence. I think also very strongly that failing to realize this on individual and collective levels contributes perhaps most significantly to the malaise in late 20th century Western life. Not realizing that we are significant and we have influence, and what we do does make a difference, and what we do not do does make a difference. A person casting a vote in 1933 for the National Socialist Party was also casting a vote for mass executions and graves and gas chambers and crematoria. A person saluting Sieg Heil at one of the many mass Nazi demonstrations was also giving support to and authorizing the total inversion of values, where a society could say what is bad is good and what is dark is the brightest light. A stone thrown by a person in November 38 during Kristallnacht gave again authorization to the official systematic beginning of the breaking and shattering of bodies and souls of millions of Jews and millions of other people. Our lives have consequences once we separate our actions from some ultimate future, or once we assume that what we do is not important, or if we simply are blind to the fact that something we are doing in the present may be affected by the past and indeed influence the future, then, first of all, we wouldn't be meeting here, and we would have, if we did want to meet over issues like this, many, many more severe and tragic and nightmarish concerns to deal with. We today have to accept, we here, the academic, scientific, medical communities, that there is consequence to what we do and what we don't do, and to how we do it and how we do not do it. That the questions that will be asked here over the next few days and those which will be asked after this conference closes are part of the process of human free choice and responsibility. They are not a matter simply of intellectual curiosity, academic or scientific interest, but somehow or another they affect the quality of life for us now and for future generations. It's with that ultimacy I think we have to deal. Bruno Bettelheim wrote that the Holocaust highlights the dangers to human beings inherent in modern mass society and in modern science. I think the Holocaust, and though there is an argument whether it should be treated as a unique historical event or just one of a number of tragic events that quantitatively surpassed all others, nevertheless perhaps can be considered as the cutting edge. When it comes into contact in the late 20th century with science and medicine and technology, I think that point becomes even more poignant. That the Holocaust can be constructively exploited to test us and to refine our thinking and hopefully to challenge us in the determination of what directions we take, what roads we travel, and which ones we bypass. To understand the Holocaust, we can't see it simply in terms of biomedical ethic-related issues. To understand this, I believe we have to at least mention here the other Holocaust-related issues which so many are dealing with today. The issue of historical revisionism. The Holocaust never happened, or at least it didn't happen in any fashion that approximates what Jews would like us to believe. The co-opting of Holocaust language, which Professor Yehuda Bauer began exploring a decade ago, when we start using words like Nazis and genocide and Holocaust to describe, granted, very serious and tragic events, but not events that really are identical with the Nazi-perpetuated Holocaust. What are the effects of co-opting the language of the Holocaust? What about survivors, children of survivors? The issue now, debated with not much press coverage, but it is an intense debate, the descendants of Nazis. How do they relate to one another, to themselves, to their future, to their responsibility? Neo-Nazism, racism, which still exists, though we're approaching the 21st century, and every time a shuttle returns, I shudder at the fact that these pockets of such painful darkness still exist in our world. How about American and other Allied complicity, not bombing the camps, immigration restrictions, which could have saved people if they did not exist or were changed, or the cooperative efforts between Americans and Nazi criminals following the war, resulting in some very questionable and ethical questions in their own right. And then there's the role of the church, or the lack thereof, the debate, as I mentioned, the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and there are others I'm sure each of us could elaborate upon. It's in this context that we gather here today. And again, I think when science and technology and medicine meet the Holocaust, we're dealing with perhaps what is now the cutting edge. Professor Alfred Kaiser mentioned that the Holocaust is still the burning ground over which every new generation in the 20th century must pass. To me, this is perhaps the most important criterion of determining if one is responsibly dealing with the Holocaust. Namely, is one feeling the fire, the heat, the angst, the tension that the Holocaust, again, if not exclusively, definitely most intensely confronts us with? Or are we, in fine late 20th century fashion, taking the more comfortable and convenient route, taking a detour around this ground to avoid the heat, to avoid the effort required to traverse this territory? Or are we doing the work we need to do? This conference, I think, speaks to the fact that we are traveling through the flames, through the pressure, through the challenges, and this is the only way that there can be any justification, any legitimacy to our results. In the Mishnah Avot, we are taught by Rabbi Hanina ben Dusa that if one's deeds exceed one's wisdom, then one's wisdom will endure. The rabbis of the first century, from where this teaching comes, were well aware that learning, intellectual prowess, does not guarantee ethical behavior. I think that's a caution to us, to those who came before us, and hopefully to those after us. We have to be modest, we have to be somewhat humbled, and we cannot assume because we're so smart, we are so good. We have to remember that the perpetrators of the Holocaust were very educated, people with PhDs, MDs, a number of degrees, trained and disciplined in the rigors of German universities. These are the people, along with bankers and industrialists in higher quote-unquote society, who perpetuated, executed the Holocaust. And though these people have been judged and need to be judged ongoingly, perhaps eternally, I think we have to stop sometimes and try to identify with these people as well and realize how different are we from them, Do we not have our own limitations, our own egos, our own insecurities, our need for grant money, our need for recognition, our own vulnerabilities? Because we are human and we do have these vulnerabilities, we do have these blind spots. And I think this conference, from what I am familiar with what led to it, assumes that these exist and that they need to be acknowledged and encountered and definitely not overlooked. And in concluding, I would like to turn to Dr. Kaplan's words, which for me and I know others, poetically and very poignantly captured what perhaps the challenge is, that if indeed we decide that there is a way and a place to use this research, that there is a method with which it should be used, it should be defined by the researcher needing to confront the ghosts of the victims. And even more so, Dr. Kaplan suggests, perhaps demands, that anyone else who will use that research needs to confront the ghosts of the victims. My fear is that, in spite of intent, this is hard to do, since the forces of history, by purpose or by circumstance, lead so often to anonymity and transparency. And what may remain is not how this research was done, but look at what good it did. The ends do justify the means, because history generally records only the victories. In this case, history will record the great medical advancements. And I think we have to very modestly be aware of that. In a play called Auschwitz by Peter Barnes, he writes, "In centuries to come, when our complexes at Auschwitz are empty ruins, monuments to past civilization, they'll ask what kind of people built and maintained these extraordinary structures. People are asking today what kind of people would use the data derived by experiments in these structures. Others are asking, how can we not use this data if it will help improve life, diminish suffering, and save lives?" I think there are many questions here as to how and why and when not. I do feel strongly that it is possible to revile the memories of the Holocaust victims by what we do and we don't do with our lives, but I feel very, very strongly that we can easily, I will not say easily, perhaps by living our lives in a certain way, that the direct results can be a reverence for the memories of the victims. So I would not conclude in any way that showing respect to their memories and using for tikkun olam purposes, for the repair of the universe, for healing the world purposes, that these have to be mutually exclusive. And finally, with the last teaching, which perhaps will bring things into focus here in an academic context, again from the Mishnah Avot, we are taught that an argument, a machloket, which is for the sake of heaven, l'shem shemayim, will endure. And so the commentators asked, how does one determine? What is the criteria? Are the criteria to conclude that an argument is for the sake of heaven? The commentators consistently point to the following. If those engaged in an argument are concerned not with being right, but with discovering what is right, then the argument is for the sake of heaven. I would suggest then, over these next few days, the questions, the issues which are raised, the discussions, the debates and arguments which will take place, and all those which will ensue after the closure of this conference, can very much so not only be in the name of heaven, but can also improve very significantly the well-being of life here on this planet Earth. Baruchim haba'im, may your coming here be for a blessing.
I'm Bart Gailey, Director of Continuing Medical Education. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. And although logistical details pale in the context of the subject we're discussing and Rabbi Wise's presentation, I would like to mention several things at this point. As has been mentioned, one of the purposes of this conference is to encourage discussion and debate. In order to facilitate that, we have decided that we would like to get all questions for the speakers and the panels in written form. So in your packet you do have several question cards, and I encourage you to use those to write out your questions. If you run out of those, we have more at the registration desk, and you can use other paper as well. Someone will circulate before the question periods, before the panels, to collect those from you, and we will use those for the panel and question and answer sessions. The second issue involves the video cameras. We did not want this conference to be interrupted by the many television stations that expressed an interest in it. And in order to facilitate that, we do have these cameras in place. You have seen the signs outside the door asking you to simply come in or leave between major conference segments, and we ask again that you honor that, again, in order to minimize the disruption to the conference as much as possible. Having said that, I too would like to extend my welcome to everyone who is here today, and hope that you find today and the next 2 days a productive experience. Our next speaker, I think, likes to get to the point quickly and is skilled at doing so, and recognizing that there are many things that one can say about Arthur Caplan, but I will give a brief introduction. He is the director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the University of Minnesota and is a professor in the departments of philosophy and surgery. He was formerly associate director at the Hastings Center, has taught at Columbia University, where he received his PhD, and at the University of Pittsburgh. His scholarly activities are extensive. They have led to the authoring or editing of 12 books, to more than 150 articles contributed to the literature in medicine and bioethics. But I think that anyone who knows Arthur Caplan also realizes that in addition to his scholarly abilities and expertise, he brings to the discussion of biomedical ethical issues an ability to frame those issues in a manner that many people can understand. He brings a certain pragmatism, a certain clarity in his approach to things that enlarges the audience that are concerned about those issues. This has led to his involvement in writing for a number of newspapers, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. He has been seen numerous times on Nightline, ABC's World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, and is active in this community and in other communities, giving numerous presentations. He has as well served as a consultant to many organizations and has been on many national committees and advisory boards addressing issues similar to that we are discussing today. Since coming to the university, I think Dr. Caplan has raised significantly the level of energy being focused on biomedical ethical issues. He's increased the awareness significantly. I think he brings to the discussion both the desire to be pragmatic, but also a tremendous compassion, able to understand and work with competing points of view, at the same time, I think, anxious to work through those points of view to some sort of clarification of the issue. And it seems to me that for a thoughtful person, balancing, let's say, pragmatism on the one hand, compassion on the other, that the issue that we will be debating over the next 3 days presents one of the most difficult confrontations possible. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Arthur Kaplan, who will be giving the initial keynote presentation on examining the ethics of the unspeakable, the Holocaust and biomedical ethics.
Thanks, Bart. I normally do delight in getting right into the issues, but for the remarks I want to make today, I have to say that what's going to be direct for me is personal to begin with. And I, too, have an announcement about the program. I had a correspondence with one of the survivors of experiments. Eva Kaur is out there somewhere. And she had written me some time back saying, I don't think the discussion panel that you have on the question of the hypothermia data is balanced enough. And I had read some of her letters and thought, I don't know that she's a good person to put on that panel. She seems angry. I don't know that she'll contribute in a positive fashion to this subject. Well, Eva drove here from Indiana, and she pulled me aside and said, I'd like to be on this panel. I've made a lot of sacrifice to be here. I don't think it's balanced, and I don't think it's right. And one of the things that's happened to me in trying to organize this event, and I think this event has been in my head, now that I'm looking at it, for about 15 years, is that I should listen to people who are survivors. So Eva, who has her tattoo in her arm, will go on the panel tomorrow night, which means less time for everybody else, but that's a different ethics problem. The personal note I want to talk about is I would like to explain a little bit about why I and the center put this event together. It is, as many of you know, the 50th anniversary of the order allowing or directing active euthanasia against the mentally ill and insane in the German psychiatric institutions. It's the 50th anniversary of the start of the war, and so there are events that demand a response, but that isn't the sole reason why this meeting is taking place, why this conference has happened. And some people have said that the specific controversy about using data from the hypothermia experiments, exposure to cold, is the specific reason for the conference, but that is not so. It was an occasion to finally push ahead and organize a conference, but it's not the reason that this meeting is being held. The meeting is being held because while I was a graduate student in philosophy some years ago, when I looked to see and went to the library and pulled out the Nuremberg trial transcripts on the medical case, the 2 volumes in law school libraries all around the United States. They're here in Minnesota, and they were at Columbia at the time. I was bothered because, as far as I could see, only one person had taken them out in the previous 20 years, 30 years, that no one seemed to have looked at that record. I've been bothered for a long time that when I look into the books on medical ethics and bioethics in my field, the Holocaust and the role of science and medicine in it usually gets short shrift. The anthologies sometimes reprint an article by Andrew Ivy or Leo Alexander about medical crimes, but that's only sometimes, and that's about it. There really is no literature in the field of bioethics, medical ethics, about the Holocaust from the point of view of scholars and academics who work in medical ethics, and that doesn't seem right. So that when I look at the scholarship and when I look at the ability of my own field to try and grapple with the events of the Holocaust, I would have to say not adequate. When I look and have listened to my friends and colleagues dismiss out of hand the role played by medicine and science in the Holocaust as the involvement of fringe members of the health professions, fringe scientists, or only people who were forced, coerced, threatened into participation, I know that this does not square with what I believe to be true and what I think can be factually shown to be true about the involvement of medicine and science with euthanasia, genocide, torture, sterilization, racist theorizing, and murderous public health policies. And as Irv Wise commented in his remarks, I've heard too many friends and colleagues refer in contemporary debates incautiously in talking about topics in bioethics to the Holocaust, in arguments about euthanasia and living wills, in arguments about the treatment of imperiled newborns, in arguments about rationing care for the elderly or the poor, in arguments about genetic engineering, in arguments about abortion, in arguments about the use of fetal tissue for transplantation, in arguments about health promotion. We sometimes actually hear people say jokingly, but they say it, in Minnesota there are just too many health Nazis. But they say it. In arguments about public health policies and AIDS. There is a belief that the historical events of the Holocaust were particular and unique to Nazi Germany, that they are aberrant as far as civilized societies go. Yet Germany, in the period of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, was the home of the premier medical, scientific, technological expertise in the world. I do not believe that medicine and science were kicked, dragging and screaming into the Holocaust. Indeed, I believe in many ways they facilitated the Holocaust. And I do not believe the Holocaust could have unfolded in the way that it did without the active cooperation and leadership provided by mainstream, reputable science and medicine. So the aims of the conference, and the aims of some of my setting a framework for it, are fairly clear in my own mind. And I know what the agenda is that I've had in trying to think about this. And since it's the agenda I suspect that inspires our deliberations over the next few days, I don't mind sharing them with you, even though they're personal. First, to establish role, responsibility, and complicity of medicine and science in the Holocaust. Second, to encourage inquiry into why and how medical involvement in genocide, torture, exploitation, and racism occurred. Third, to encourage research by those in bioethics into the events of the Holocaust in order to assure accurate understanding of what happened, why, what ethical rationales were used to justify complicity in murder and torture, and to understand the limits and boundaries of the appropriate invocation of the Holocaust in current disputes in bioethics. It's certainly important that we assess the adequacy of existing protections, educational, legal, and regulatory, to protect against abuse of persons at the hands of healthcare professionals and scientists, even those who think of themselves as having nothing in common with German science and medicine. I hope that we will raise questions, too, about the ways in which perhaps analogous abuses are occurring even in our own time. Maybe they'll get addressed at some future meeting or symposium, that we might ask ourselves questions about medical research in South Africa or the exploitation of Native American peoples in radon studies here, or CIA activities, or what we think about the ongoing studies of radiation victims from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which provoke great discussion and moral anguish in Japan, even to this day. Those things aren't going to be settled here, but I hope we leave here thinking further about them. I hope, in other words, to set an agenda that goes far beyond questions of the use of information from Nazi experiments and torture, to have us think about the role that medicine and science played in providing the scientific underpinnings for racist ideology in the Third Reich, and to try and understand how it was that mainstream, reputable scientists from the most advanced scientific and technical society of its time could lead the operation of the trains that led to the ovens that led to the crematoria. It seems to me that's the challenge that my field has to wrestle with. And it seems to me important that it wrestle with it because without those events, there isn't a field that I'm in. It's as simple as that. The field of medical ethics or bioethics comes out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And yet, there hasn't been, in my opinion, an adequate attempt to deal with that reality. Well, what are some of the ethical questions that we're going to have to grapple with for the next 2 days? One is certainly central: can good come from evil? Is it possible to somehow take what is evil and vile and wrong and make something of benefit come from it without becoming tainted by the evil? Second, how is one held morally responsible and complicit for crimes and evil? And what sorts of excuses are not acceptable? And what sorts of modes of evading responsibility are not acceptable? Third, are there certain areas of scientific inquiry that should be off limits? Then, now, and tomorrow. Fourth, what are the limits of scientific and medical activities in support of state or social interests and objectives? What can medicine say vis-a-vis its ethical obligations and duties, vis-a-vis society and the state? What will it do? What won't it do? And lastly, are there moral prohibitions that are specific to those who work in the sciences and the health professions that do not apply to others, but that are specific here because of the nature of the relationship and dependency that exists between those who are the beneficiaries of medicine and science and those who can provide it? Well, let me move to try and bolster my claim that science and medicine were intimately involved in the Holocaust, that this was not the activities of fringe participants, that it was mainstream science and medicine who actively facilitated the Holocaust and then carried it through. I've tried to do this by supplying you, I hope many of you picked it out outside, with a chronology, science and medicine in Nazi Germany, a chronological overview, in which I tried to trace the involvement using selected examples from 1913 on through the war, and then some of the events following the war. And I'm going to be referring to that a little bit. But let me preface my review of what medicine and science actually did by a few observations. First, I do not doubt that the Holocaust would have occurred in Nazi Germany and under the Nazis with or without medical and scientific involvement. But I also have no doubt that it would not have occurred in the fashion and style and manner that it did without the active involvement of mainstream medicine and science. It seems to me also important to stress that medicine, the health professions, public health officers, and scientists were not dragged kicking and screaming and protesting into the Nazi Party. They, in fact, were early and active supporters, many within those professions, of the party and what it stood for, and they remain long-standing and active participants and supporters of the party after many others had turned away. It's also important to say that Nazi ideology was rooted firmly in racial biology, which was promulgated by internationally respected mainstream scientists. And it's also important to note that euthanasia and genocide were couched in medical and public health terminology provided by scientists and physicians. It seems to me, in other words, that a distinct and distinguishing aspect of the Holocaust is the fact that it occurred under medical supervision with scientific support and the involvement of mainstream medicine and science from the most technologically, scientifically, and medically advanced society of its time. I don't say that's the only thing that's unique about the Holocaust, but what I do say is that that is a dimension of mass killing and genocide that is particular to the Holocaust. Well, what was the level of involvement? I'm not going to review the whole chronology for you. You can look at that, the one I've developed when you have time. Let me simply point out, by just looking from 1913 up until the outbreak of the war in 1939, the degree to which science and medicine were involved in laying the foundation for the Holocaust. In 1913, Eugen Fischer, an anatomist and a well-respected one at Freiburg University, published a book about mixed-blood people in Southwest Africa, recommending that they be offered only minimal protection by the authorities as a race inferior to ourselves. In 1918, Herman Siemens publishes a widely read article, What is Race Hygiene?, in which he warns that the quality of the human race will decline if the genetically unfit are allowed to breed more than the fit. In 1920, Alfred Hoche, professor of psychiatry at Freiburg, and his colleague there, Rudolf Binding, publish a book, Permitting the Destruction of Lives Not Worth Living. They maintain the right to life has to be earned and justified, that it is not simply assumed or granted. And they argue that those incapable of human feeling, whom they refer to as empty human husks, who now live in the mental hospitals, should be destroyed out of compassion as a humane act. In 1923, Hitler, while spending some time in jail, reads a textbook, Principles of Human Heredity and Race Hygiene. Two of the editors of the book are Eugen Fischer and Fritz Lenz. He incorporates some of the race hygiene theory advanced in that textbook right into Mein Kampf. In 1927, the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, the most important institution for promoting the study of science in Germany, creates the Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics in Berlin. Its director is Eugen Fischer, who becomes chairman 2 years later of the Committee on Racial Crosses of the International Federation of Eugenic Organizations. In 1929, 42 male and 2 female physicians formed the National Socialist Physicians League to coordinate Nazi medical policy and, quoting their founding document, to purify the German medical community of the influence of Jewish Bolshevism. In 1931, Fritz Lenz publishes the 3rd edition of his widely read Human Genetics textbook, in which he calls National Socialism applied biology. In 1931, still many years away from the beginning of the war, Himmler orders that members of the SS must obtain permission to be granted for marriage on grounds of hereditary and racial health. Fritz Lenz, by now a prominent scientific supporter and provider of scientific underpinnings for the party, calls this a very worthwhile exercise. By January 1933, 2,800 doctors, 6% of the whole medical profession, have joined the Nazi Physicians League. It's 3 times the rate for the general population. It's 15 times the rate for judges. By July 14, 1933, the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring has been enacted. This permits sterilization of anyone suffering from genetically determined illnesses, which were defined to include feeble-mindedness, deafness, severe alcoholism, Huntington's chorea, and insanity.